Hey guys, it's your boy Goffy Harry. So today we are gonna see what if Harry Potter had GEASS eyes? Please like, share, and drop so many comments. Also join Patreon for something very steamy and link in the description. Also please go and support author for his wonderful creation. Takes place during the 5th year for the Golden Trio. Voldemort does not have Horcruxes. Dumbledore is slightly demented and evil. Slightly. All of the Voldemort occasions year 1 to 4 are actually something Dumbledore created as an illusion to make Harry hate Voldemort. Voldemort did not kill Lily and James. Dumbledore did. Dumbledore actually killed Cedric Diggory. Voldemort is actually a good guy. Bad Hermione. Bad Ron. Changes to Code GEASS. Takes place right before the Zero Requiem. Gino decided to stay with Britannia and became loyal to Lelouch. Lelouch chose 2 knights. Lelouch and Gino. Nunnally did not betray Lelouch and was understanding when she found he was Zero. The Black Knights stayed loyal to Lelouch/Zero. Cullen stayed loyal as well. Britannia in the show/manga is in the Japan area. In this fanfic, imagine that Britannia is an alternate world. If you don't know what I am talking about, think about in Kingdom Hearts. The world that never was is an alternate world of Twilight Town. It is basically another world right beside and connected to Earth. If that makes any sense. Warnings. Throughout the story there will be spoilers for both Code GEASS and Harry Potter, so I highly suggest you finish reading/watching Code GEASS and or Harry Potter, but if you wish you can read this and have things spoiled for you, it is honestly your choice on the matter. Also this story will have yaoi/shonen AI. This means boy on boy couples. This story is rated T. For now. My pairings include Lelouch x Gino x Suzaku and Harry x Draco. So if any of this does not float your boat, do not flame for this factor and do not read. This also includes a threesome pairing. Don't get too freaked out. Flames and reviews. Flaming me will not get you anywhere. Flaming equals you saying mean things that don't involve errors in the story. I.e. you suck, you need to get a life. On the other hand, reviews are my Girl Scout cookies. They help me move along. Although I will never demand for them. Yeah. I won't update unless I get 5 reviews. If you have any questions or concerns, you can leave it in a review or send it in a message to me. Remember, kiddies, your review equals my success. Suzaku? Gino? Can you meet me in my office? Lelouch, the Emperor of Britannia, asked his knights. They nodded and began to clean up their nightmare cleaning kits. I wonder what Lelouch wants now? Gino asked, then smirked. He sure can be a whiny emperor. Suzaku laughed at the odd impression of Lelouch. He was whiny when he was a kid too. Suzaku said, joining in the fun of poking fun of Lelouch, the most feared man in Britannia. Hey, I can hear you. Lelouch shouted out of his open door. The 2 knights laughed even harder. They put their equipment back in their boxes before heading into Lelouch's office. He gestured for them to sit, meaning it would be a fairly long meeting. Now you guys both remember what I told you about the Zero Requiem, right? At this, both of the expert nightmare pilots blanched. They had argued with him for weeks about not going through with the plan for Suzaku to dress up as Zero and kill Lelouch in front of everyone in order to eliminate all the hate in the world. They both nodded and Lelouch continued, well, I have a better idea now. Gino and Suzaku stood quickly at the same time, before turning to each other. They hooped for a couple seconds before wisely sitting back down. Well, are you going to die? Gino winced at his casual tone. In this plan too? Nope, was the blunt reply he gave his 2 knights. Gino waved his right hand in a gesture meaning to hurry up and explain. Lelouch shook his head in amusement before continuing. You see, I have found an area in which we can help. It is in the midst of battle, and if we help them they will become a valuable ally. After a moment of stunned silence, it was Suzaku who spoke. Well, what is this area? Lelouch crossed his legs and steepled his fingers with his elbows resting on his desk. Wizarding London in England. You see, they are currently in a battle between 2 wizards. An old guy who is very powerful named Dumbledore on the light side. Then on the dark side there is an immortal by the name of Voldemort. If you ask me, I wouldn't want to join either side, so I ask that you 2 join me at Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, as 7th years, to see which side truly deserves our help. There was even longer stunned silence, before Gino burst out laughing. I knew you would finally go crazy. he said, and Suzaku couldn't help but crack a small smile. To their surprise, however, Lelouch smirked before waving his hand at a goblet which turned into a cat, much to Suzaku's distaste. "Never mind," mumbled the stunned blonde nightmare pilot. The stunned brown-haired pilot nodded as well. "Now go pack," said a stern Lelouch, who stood and walked to the door. "Meet me here tomorrow at 8. Ignoring Gino groans of too early, Lelouch walked out to start his own packing. He had to talk to Nunnally as well. 8:15 the next day. "Sorry I'm late, guys. I had a rough night," said a very tired Lelouch. They started their walk to Lloyd's lab area, where their nightmare frames were currently being updated for London and Hogwarts. Lelouch yawned into his hand before pushing the lab doors open. Inside Lloyd's lab, there were 3 nightmares side by side, all with new improvements. The first was a black and gold frame with burgundy wings for flight. Lelouch walked up to it and said, "Thanks for the update on the Shinkiro." Gino looked over at the second one with white, blue and yellow colors with red wings and whistled. It belonged to Gino himself and was named Tristan. "I hope you find the updates to the Shinkiro and the Tristan to your liking, boys. I really had fun updating the Lancelot as well." Lloyd's eyes brightened as he mentioned the nightmare he had created himself for Suzaku. The Lancelot gleamed in all its white and gold glory, its wings a bright green. "Yes, of course, Professor Lloyd. It all looks wonderful. Could you load it in the carrier?" "Yes, the smaller one. Also place our nightmare clothing in there as well. We need to go to the kitchens and then talk to some people. We expect it to be ready in an hour." "Thanks," said a tired Lelouch. Gino and Suzaku followed the shuffling Lelouch all the way to the kitchens, where the cook handed them all steaming cups of coffee. "What would you like for breakfast, my lord?" Gino and Suzaku had already eaten, and had not been aware that Lelouch hadn't eaten yet. Lelouch sat down in one of the dining chairs backwards. "Nothing, thank you anyway," Lelouch said as he massaged his temples. He felt Suzaku's cold hands carefully remove his hands, and took their place, gently massaging his temple, making it feel slightly better. "Get him some Tylenol," Suzaku mumbled, and the maid nodded before walking to the medicine cabinet in the kitchen. She walked back with a bottle and a container of Tylenol. Gino mumbled a thanks as he took it from her and set the bottle beside Lelouch on the table. He opened the container and shook out a couple of the pills. Suzaku slowly stopped massaging Lelouch's temple, causing a moan of disapproval. Suzaku and Gino smirked before Gino grabbed Lelouch's hand. He put the pills in his hand and handed him the water bottle. After swallowing the pills, Lelouch stood. "Thanks," Lelouch mumbled as he rubbed his eyes. "No, let's go talk to Colin. She will be taking my place while I'm gone." They both nodded and they headed to the nightmare training field. They saw the red Gurin in the distance. Apparently Colin saw them as well because she sped over to them. When she came to a stop, she opened the hatch to the Gurin and rose with her left hand over her heart, her head bowed in respect. "Is it time for me to take you place, for the time being, my lord?" she asked in a ruling tone that reminded Lelouch why it was her who would be his replacement for the time. "Yes, thank you, Colin," Lelouch said before turning sharply, his cape billowing out behind him. Gino and Suzaku nodded their heads in respect at the red-headed nightmare pilot, before turning and following their emperor, who quite frankly had a dreadful headache. They boarded the carrier that would take them to London. There was a wizard landing spot at which they could land safely. The carrier would stay there and hold their nightmares until they left for Hogwarts, which the ever-so-kind Dumbledore has allowed them to take the nightmares. "Well, are you just going to prance in there saying you're the Emperor of Britannia, and we are you trusted chosen knights?" Suzaku asked sarcastically once they were sitting comfortably on the couch. "Of course not. I plan on keeping my identity a secret for only a couple months before I reveal to them my true name. So for now on you must refrain from calling me Your Highness, my Lord ECT. Also I shall be Lelouch Lamperouch." Suzaku grimaced. That name just brings up loads of bad memories. Then he looked thoughtful for a moment before hastily adding, "Although if that's what you want, don't let me stop you." Lelouch smiled thankfully before laying down on the couch. He had been sitting in between Suzaku and Gino so naturally, he put his long legs in Suzaku's lap, and his head gently in Gino's. How's that headache now? Suzaku asked. Not too bad, just a throb every once in a while instead of never breaking throbs like before, he said as he opened one eye before lazily closing it again. Gino began to softly play with Lelouch's hair as he rested, massaging his head gently. What is it with you two and my head? He mumbled, most likely not even aware he said it in the first place. Gino and Suzaku had to hold in their laughter at this one, and almost couldn't when he added, it feels really good though. Suzaku and Gino talked about the precautions they would need to take the rest of the flight in dull whispers, careful not to wake the overly stressed teenage emperor. Dumbledore stroked his beard thoughtfully. It might be beneficial to have some foreign exchange students from Britannia. I heard they are very powerful and wealthy as a country. Dumbledore thought greedily. He then proceeded to take out a piece of parchment to write the approval of sending 3 boys to join as 7th years. The carrier landed smoothly on the wizarding platform, and it didn't even wake the light sleeper named Lelouch. Gino sighed before he gently started to shake Lelouch's shoulders, his head still on his lap. Suzaku gently lifted Lelouch's legs off of him before setting them back on the couch. Lelouch sleepily sat up and rubbed his eyes. Time to go already? He asked, barely aware of the time he had spent sleeping. Yep, so you need to get up now, said Suzaku, and he held out a hand for Lelouch to help him up. We can go to the nearest coffee shop and get you some coffee, that's bound to help. Lelouch nodded and excused himself to the private bathroom in the carrier, making sure to look presentable. He changed into an outfit that was a cross between what the Knights of the Round wore and his own personal Zero outfit. He brushed his hair to the side and stepped out of the bathroom looking ready to talk business. There's the Emperor we all know and love. I couldn't recognize him a minute ago, Gino said, good-naturally causing Suzaku to snort. Both Suzaku and Gino had changed from their regular clothing to their Knight of the Round uniforms. They both had the coats with the giant hoods on as well, having just put them on. Lelouch walked over to the coat rack and picked up his purple version of the coat. They all nodded to each other and Gino stepped out of the carrier and onto the exiting steps first, then Lelouch and lastly Suzaku. It was a natural way to exit when someone important was on board. They never exited first nor last. There were quite a few people there who all looked at the 3 in amazement. Lelouch smirked before beginning to wave. Gino turned around, pulled his hand back down his side. Behave, Suzaku scolded quietly. Gino and Lelouch dipped their heads in mock shame. A man walked toward them as they walked even farther from the carrier. They stopped and the man came all the way up to them. Hello, Dumbledore sent me to take you to the Leaky Cauldron, where you will stay until the start of term. Next to it is Diagon Alley, where you can get all your school supplies. They nodded and followed him all the way until they got to the inside of the Leaky Cauldron. They walked up to the bar where a man by the name of Tom was at. Dumbledore has reserved a room for these gentlemen to stay in. The man named Tom nodded and gestured for the 3 newcomers to follow him to their room. They followed him and finally they reached a room. It had a couch, 3 beds, and a bathroom. It also had a fireplace and a small kitchen. Dumbledore suggested that we go to Diagon Alley tomorrow, so we should get a good night's sleep. I can take my shower in the morning if you want to go ahead and take yours now, Lelouch, Suzaku said, keeping in consideration that because Lelouch is not a morning person, he could let the prince sleep in Gino as well. Lelouch smiled gratefully before noticing his stuff was already on his bed. He walked to the bathroom and proceeded to take a very hot shower. When he was done, he wrapped a towel around his waist and walked out of the bathroom, fluffing his hair with a towel as he walked. He walked over to his suitcase and took out his clothes before shuffling back in the bathroom gracefully. Shuffling gracefully is something only Lelouch can do. Suzaku and Gino's faces both had light blushes across their faces at the sight of a practically naked emperor, whose slender figure was something a girl would die for. After a couple minutes, Lelouch walked out of the bathroom dressed in blue sweatpants. He walked to his bag and took another dose of Tylenol before moving all his stuff to the table. Seeing that Gino and Suzaku were already in their beds, he turned out the lights and crawled into his own bed, and after a couple minutes of pondering his choices for him and his best friends, he fell into a restless sleep. There were newcomers in the street of Diagon Alley along with most of the regulars. These newcomers were different than most newcomers, and completely oblivious to the threats in the new world they had come to. Lelouch, Suzaku, and Gino looked over their lists of school supplies. Suzaku had graciously decided to scribble down a shorter version of what they needed. They had already gotten their many books, their potions ingredients, a cauldron each, ink and quills, and had been measured for robes that would be delivered by the evening. They had yet to get wands, any pets they wanted, and Kadich equipment. Lelouch turned to Suzaku, who looked over the things they had left to do. Well, I guess we are going to get our wands now. I heard of a wand shop in the darker area of this area, called Nocturne Alley. The store actually is famous for its imported wands, and also their dark wands. Shall we take a look? At the nod of Gino and Lelouch, Suzaku led the way to the store past several crazy people, one of them talking to a wall. Yes, the same man from the movie of HBP. Soon they arrived at a store called Willowing Darkness Imported Wands. Once they were inside, they saw an anoxic woman sitting behind the counter. She was extremely pale, and her red lipstick was smudged in the corner of her mouth. She stood as we entered, and in a monotone said, "Walk around, see what you like. If you go with your gut, you shall easily find the right wand for you." She waved us over to an area that was filled with bookshelves, but instead of books crowded in them, small black rectangular boxes, with wands inside, were taking up every available space. Lelouch automatically followed his gut, and walked to the area labeled "Created with Dark Ingredients." Suzaku warily watched him, not knowing what dark ingredients meant. Lelouch hesitantly picked up one of the boxes and pulled out a white and black wand. It had a purple handle, with the white and black colors like strands, weaving around each other until the very tip. Unsure of what to do with it, Lelouch looked around before waving it slightly. The air seemed to hum as the wand chose Lelouch as its master. Lelouch smirked before lazily waving at Suzaku and Gino with his wand-less hand, as if mocking them because he found his wand first. Suzaku pulled out a random box to reveal a plain wooden wand. He waved it, and a high-pitched scream echoed around the room. Suzaku hurriedly put it back. After 4 more tries, he pulled out a silver wand. It had a gold, white, and blue strips weaving together, with a brown handle. He waved it, and once again the air hummed. Gino was the last to find his wand. Eventually he found a green wand with 4 small yellow, blue, white, and red stripes that went from the white handle to the tip. They made their way over to the anoxic women and put their wands, currently in their boxes, on the table. The lady grabbed Suzaku's first and pulled it out of the black box. She closely examined it before saying, "This wand is 12 inches, contains hair of the Anubis, and feathers from a rare male siren," she said before ringing in the price of the wand. "You must be a very loyal protector and a strong opponent." She then reached into Lelouch's box and pulled out his chosen wand. Well, this here is 11 inches, contains the sand of the Sphinx, venom of a manticore, and the tears of the Simurgh. You must be extremely intelligent, but also bloodthirsty or ruthless. You must also have the blood of high royalty due to the tears of the Simurgh. They are extremely picky. She entered the much higher price in the register. Once again Gino was last. This one is 13 inches, contains scales of a hydra and the fur of a Gabriel hound. Because this wand chose you, you must have unimaginable stamina, and extreme loyalty and fighting skills as well. She rung in the price, and shortly after, the trio, not the Golden Trio, walked out of Nocturne Alley and back into Diagon Alley. Suzaku once again took out his paper with the supplies. "How about we get Kadich supplies first, then if we want any pets we get them last?" Suzaku asked. Gino nodded his head and Lelouch nodded. "Lead the way, Suzaku," Lelouch said and nudged Suzaku to get him moving. Suzaku rolled his eyes. He knew that Lelouch didn't know the way to the Kadich shop, whatever that was. But Lelouch also knew that Suzaku didn't have any clue either. He just didn't want to admit that he didn't know the way. After 20 minutes, it would have been longer if Gino hadn't got the courage to admit defeat and ask an old lady where the store was. They arrived in front of the store. The doorbell rang loudly as they entered. They looked around and very surprised at the sight of the moving pictures of people flying on brooms. Lelouch walked up to the counter and saw several brooms in the display case behind the counter. "Hello, would you like to get a package deal?" the man behind the counter asked. Lelouch nodded, And the man continued. We have many types of brooms, from the fastest, which is the firebolt, to the oldest broom called the shooting star. The kit comes with a cleaning kit and your choice of 5 books about Quidditch. Suzaku and Gino were standing behind Lelouch, and Suzaku spoke up. Tell me more about the firebolt. The man nodded and pulled out a gleaming brook from behind the counter. This here is the firebolt. It is made of ash wood treated with a diamond hard polish, with a tail of birch twigs. It is capable of going from 0 to 150 miles per hour in 10 seconds. The firebolt also has an unbreakable braking charm, superb balance and precision, and hovers at reasonable mounting height when let go. It is currently the fastest broomstick in the world, and it is also the most expensive broom brand in the world. There is a color charm included in the packages that allow you to turn it any color you wish, he concluded. Suzaku looked at Lelouch and Gino as if silently asking them whether that was what they wanted. Lelouch slowly nodded, thinking about how much money they had left. After exchanging their muggle money for galleons and creating vaults, one being too small, they were told that they were some of the richest people they had in the bank, third only to the Malfoy and the Potter family. They still had a lot, and even knowing that they shouldn't blow it off, that this was for school, there for something that was worth spending money on. They ordered the firebolts and the package deal, and went and pick out several books on the sport and rules of Quidditch. They then paid extra to have them sent to their room in the Leaky Cauldron. Once outside, Gino looked around before spotting a store with many owls in front, along with other animals. Gino grabbed their arms before half leading them, half dragging them towards the pet shop. Once inside, Gino walked over to a cage with small black puppies, forgetting he was still dragging Lelouch and Suzaku along. He removed his hands from their wrists and leaned forward with his hands on his knees in order to get a better view of the black puppies. One of them tottered toward Gino before plopping down on his butt, and gave him the puppy dog eyes. Gino awed, and suddenly the puppy shifted into the form of a snake that hissed, before turning into a cat and meowing, then finally going back into the form of a puppy. Gino, Lelouch, and Suzaku stared at it open-mouthed, as the store owner walked up to them. What you see here is the beast of Darthmore. They are shape-shifters, but in these little guys' case their original form is a dog. As they grow up, they change the size of anything they transform into and make it bigger. Eventually they will be able to transform into horses, lions, etc., he said calmly. Lelouch, Gino, and Suzaku now had looks of admiration at the small puppies. The owner walked away to greet more customers while Gino cautiously put his hand in the pen, and all the puppies swarmed it, licking and nibbling it. Gino smiled and picked up the one that was so into him earlier. She squirmed around until Gino put her up to his chest. She put her paws on his chest and licked his face, causing the blonde knight of the round to giggle. Later Gino would claim it had been a chuckle or laugh and not a giggle. Lelouch and Suzaku seemed to get the idea and each picked up a puppy. Gino turned to the others with puppy dog of his own and proceeded to bounce the puppy up and down to keep it entertained while he silently begged to keep him. Lelouch just smiled at the sight. He hadn't seen him this happy, this truly happy since before he switched to his side of the war. He glanced over at Suzaku and saw him grinning at the little boy Darthmore he was holding and cooed nonsense words to him, and gave it a kiss on the forehead. Lelouch shook his head, thinking about how a couple of puppies could change the attitude of the closest people to him. The little girl in his arms yipped, not enjoying being forgotten, and nibbled on his neck, causing him to squirm. They followed Lelouch over to the area where the food and supplies were. They watched as he looked through the food, until he found the food for the Darthmore. After reading the back of the bags, Lelouch saw that whatever your Darthmore currently was in the form of, the food would change inside the bag, so when you poured it out it would be the appropriate food type. He then found dog beds that changed size when your pet grew bigger and a couple toys. They walked up to the counter to see the clerk look at them in surprise. Wow, I didn't think you'd want them. Everyone is always too freaked to even think about buying one, not to mention 3. Well, I'll ring up the price for you. Can I interest you into buying an owl? We just got a new group. At their nod, she gestured to a small cage. Go ahead and take a look. You can put the pups in this cage that comes with them while you look. Lelouch led the way over to the area he had pointed out. He looked around to see many owls around on perches, all different colors. I think because of the amount of money we have spent already, We should just get one owl. Suzaku said, with confirming nods from Lelouch and Suzaku. They browsed through the owls before finally choosing a black owl that had bright blood-red eyes. Putting her in the cage, the owner told them the importance of caring for their owl, and after picking out owl supplies, they paid extra to use their fireplace to flew to their room, along with their pets and supplies. After sorting their stuff and putting them in their school trunks, Lelouch pulled out the guide to Quidditch along with a book about the rules. He took his puppy, which he named Serafina, Sarah for short, and crawled into his bed. Opening the book, he felt Sarah curl up against his side sleepily. He heard Suzaku start talking to his Fangulator, Fong, and Gino scold Tatiana Tati for peeing on the floor. Lelouch chuckled before turning to the table of contents, determined to figure out the complicated game of Quidditch. Review my kitties. You'll receive your very own Beast of Darth Moor. The platform of 9 3/4 was crowded. As usual on the day, the Hogwarts Express was heading towards Hogwarts with hundreds of new and old students. Harry Potter stepped through the barrier between the Wizarding train station and the normal Muggle King's Cross station. He looked around and saw his friends standing together, flirting non-stop. A brief flash of pain crossed the boy who lived's face, before he turned and strode the other way. People looked at him, unsure of whom he was. They looked at him as though they remembered him, but not where from or who he was. Harry shook his head as he thought back to his summer. He had went to Diagon Alley in the middle of the summer to get some food for Hedwig, making some lame excuse to the Dursleys about a friend wanting him over for the day. He had passed a cafe and heard the familiar voices of his best friends. He was just about to walk up to the redhead and brunette when he heard his name mentioned. He crouched low and listened carefully to what his friends were saying. I swear, Harry gets whinier every year. I can't believe we have to hang out with him this year. Ron complained loudly, ignoring the pointed glares people were giving him for being so loud and obnoxious. Hermione batted her eyelashes and purposefully scooted closer, so her boobs were squishing Ron's arm. No, just no. I think we should ask Dumbledore for a raise. We were so naive in first year when he offered to pay us to get close to him. We should have requested more money. That way we can eventually rub it in Harry's face that we have all his money. Hermione said and winked at Ron. Ron smirked as his hand snaked under her skirt. That was all Harry could take, and he bolted the opposite direction. He slowed as he passed a new potion store that sold only finished potions, not ingredients. A sign by the door caught Harry's eye. It read, New Nutrition Potion. In 12 hours you are cured of malnutrition. Will make you look like you would if never malnourished. Harry strolled into the store. 12 agonizing hours of writhing in pain in his room paid off well, along with the new clothing he had bought. After taking the potion that made him 5'11" with a lean body with well-earned muscles that were not bulky in any way, he went shopping. He had spent half the day with a nice girl named Annabeth, who worked at a dark clothing store. She had redressed him numerous times to find his colors, to find they were green, blue, black, and silver. He needed to avoid red as much as possible apparently, which made Harry burst out laughing. Along with his brand new contacts and a green spiked haircut, he looked like a completely different person. End of flashback. Harry smirked towards the people who had been staring at him, causing them to turn and blush. He was extremely thankful for the hair that covered his unusual scar from prying eyes. He looked around once again before boarding the train. He went from car to car until he found an empty one. He closed the compartment and just sat there as the train started. About 20 minutes later, screaming was heard in the distance, and suddenly the door opened to reveal Draco Malfoy. He quickly closed the door and waited until the screaming fangirls passed before calmly looking at the unfamiliar face. He sat down across from Harry, before slowly extending his hand, almost dramatically. I don't believe we've met. Malfoy. Draco Malfoy. He drawled as he introduced himself to Harry. Harry smirked slightly before grasping hands with his biggest rival. I do believe we have, Harry said and paused dramatically. Potter. Harry Potter, he said with a smirk. Draco's smirk faltered for a second as he recognized his rival's tone. Then he sneered for a moment before drawling once again. So where's the mudblood and weasel at now? Harry's smirk went to a scowl in a matter of seconds. Draco thought that he was going to yell at him for calling his friends mudblood and weasel, but then he realized Harry's fury wasn't directed towards him. I don't care where those fucking traitors are. I hope they are rotting in hell, but that's too good to be true in my world. Harry spat out each word like venom, and Draco realized he was telling the truth. Draco smirked at his rival before asking, "So what's made the Golden Boy hate the rest of the trio?" Harry made a face at the name Golden Boy, but proceeded to tell Draco exactly what happened. Then they talked about how their summers were. Draco's filled with formal dinners and a trip to his cousins in America for a week. Harry talked a little about his summer, leaving out everything that had to do with the Dursley family, including the frequent beatings and decisions to starve their least favorite family member. They were interrupted by two very rude Gryffindor fifth years about halfway to Hogwarts. "Have you seen Harry anywhere?" Hermione asked, almost spitting mad. Draco spotted a glimpse of hurt cross Harry's face before he scowled at them. "Don't know, not that you really care." He all but snarled, and slammed the compartment door in their stunned faces. They didn't get any other visits the rest of the ride. When the train stopped, the two split ways without a goodbye or backwards glance. Harry headed towards what he thought was an empty carriage. When he opened it, he was mildly surprised to see two Hufflepuff girls and a Hufflepuff boy in the younger years. They were comfortable with Harry riding with him, and he didn't speak another word on the way to the castle. Once inside the Great Hall, Harry made his way to the empty Gryffindor table. 10 minutes later, the Great Hall was filled with Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin students alike. Harry was chatting with a couple of seventh years who were very interested in trying out for Quidditch that year. Then Dumbledore silenced the hall and announced that the sorting would begin. Gryffindor earned a couple good kids, but a lot reminded Harry of nervous little kids that got beat up at his old school. Maybe it was the nerves of being somewhere new, but it seemed that Slytherin got a good bunch this year. None of the students were quivering in fear, and they walked proudly over to the Snake Pit's table. Then Dumbledore started his speech, "Welcome students to Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." He kept going on about rules, Quidditch, etc. Then a demented look only Harry and the Slytherins caught lit up Dumbledore's face. "This year we will be proud to once again have exchange students join us at our castle. They will be joining us from Britannia as representatives for their country. You see, they don't have any magic schools there, seeing as it is in a different dimension, so they would like to know whether or not it is worth sending their students here. You must make a good impression on these people. Because of their arrival, classes will be starting in 2 days. If you wish to see their arrival, it will be at the front of the castle at 12 o'clock. Now how about we dig in?" Harry shook his head in disgust at the crazy old man as the rest of the table looked up at him in admiration, although he did the same in the past years, and Draco noticed this slight change from his table. Harry looked around, not feeling very hungry. He watched curiously as Hermione and Ron approached Dumbledore. Harry was able to read their lips to understand their conversation. "Where is Scarhead?" Ron asked angrily. "Is he even here?" Hurt crossed Harry's face again. Dumbledore sighed before impatiently scanning the crowd of students. "I know he is here. The barrier alerted me of his presence in the castle a little bit ago." Dumbledore seemed to give up for a second as he listened to Hermione speak. "Well, he's probably off sulking, feeling bad for himself. He shouldn't be casting us aside like that." Her hair was even frizzier in her anger. Harry slowly rose from the table, catching the attention of most of the Gryffindor and the neighboring house. He ignored their looks of confusion and sauntered away from the table, intending to be the first to leave the feast. He wasn't looking where he was going in his anger, and ran right into Draco Malfoy. Everyone went quiet. Nobody ever ran into a Malfoy and didn't live to regret it. Harry looked at Draco. A mixture of anger and an apology in the green orbs made Draco realize he wasn't mad at him. He looked at Potter coolly, and Harry said calmly with a curt nod, "Draco." Draco smirked as he caught on. He nodded to Harry in return. "Harry." He practically purred his name. They walked by each other, and the great hall erupted in murmurs. He saw in the corner of his eye Hermione and Ron plastering grins on their faces and walking towards him. He growled almost silently as he exited the great hall. He made it up the grand staircase in record time to the 7th floor. Instead of walking to the fat lady though, he chose to go to a secret hideout only he knew. He almost silently told the password to the portrait and went inside. It was just a small room with a couch and fireplace, along with a balcony. It had several other rooms that hadn't been explored yet. He walked out to the balcony and sat on the edge. He looked out and looked at the stars that were just beginning to appear. Sighing, he knew he wouldn't be able to get any sleep that night. Not that he hardly ever did anyway. Time skip. Harry cast Tempest to find it was 10 after 6. He slowly got up and stretched, having sat for so long he had been getting cramps. He shook his head and walked out of the room. Even early in the morning, the Gryffindor common room always had a warm fire heating up the spacious room. Harry's muscles relaxed a bit as they felt the warming sensation, but Harry kept walking to the boys' dormitory. He quietly sneaked past a snoring Ron and mumbling Seamus. He got what he needed before heading into the empty boys' showers. Stripping down, Harry proceeded to take a 20-minute shower, 10 minutes freezing cold while the other 10 were scalding hot. He just finished changing as the boys began to enter the room. He walked slowly to the Great Hall and decided to sit with some Ravenclaw Quidditch players for a while, before leaving to finish his potions assignment he hadn't completed over the summer, without eating again. He didn't notice the gray eyes watching him carefully, the graceful lips frown when he left before even touching a bite to eat. Yes, Draco Malfoy was concerned. Once again, review my kitties. Suzaku walked out of the bathroom to the full-length mirror in the bedroom. He looked at himself in the mirror. He straightened his collar on his Knight of the Round cloak. The gold glimmered on the blue cloth in the symbol of the Britannia Army, proof that it was in fact an authentic cloak. His white, black, and gold outfit was completed with his almost knee-high black boots and black gloves that went almost to the elbow, covering up every inch in his body in the tight clothing, except for his face and brown hair. He glanced to his side to see Gino in his almost identical outfit, except for the obvious difference of a green cape, not blue. There was a difference in their outfits from the rest of the Knights of the Round that only these two knights had. On the center of the back of their capes and on their breast pocket, there was a huge number 0, shaped like the Rebellion Leader Zero's helmet. It made it clear that they were the highest ranking, the Knights of Zero. He turned on his Bluetooth and saw Gino do the same. Right at that moment, Lelouch walked in, dressed as formally as the others. He was dressed just as the others, except his had the visual of royalty. His collar was slightly taller, his cape more flowing to his every move, the tight suit even more so on him, and then where the mark of the Knights of Zero was, he too had a 0, except his also had a large golden crown behind it marking him as royalty, but also had one other sign as well. It was the sign of GEASS. He knew that most kids at this new school didn't know much about Britannia, so they most likely wouldn't know much about the power of GEASS. He was slightly wary, he had been caught off guard way too many times to count. Suzaku and Gino looked at the tight outfit appreciatively before immediately realizing what they were doing and blushed a light pink. Lelouch noticed this and with a smirk, the brunette sauntered towards them with swinging hips. They noticed this and their faces went even pinker, towards a red color. Lelouch checked his contacts and made sure they were safely in place. After several minutes of standing around in a slightly awkward manner, they headed outside. They then went near King Cross Station, where their carrier was currently being held and guarded. They entered the carrier and proceeded to spend about 20 minutes on talking to the launchers and the staff who would be returning the carrier to Britannia. They shrunk all their stuff, and because of the Shinkiro's larger size, they put the tiny bags in the small carrying compartment. They all said farewell to the crew, and with a thanks they were each in their nightmare frames. Large doors big enough for each of the nightmares opened at the back, the direction the nightmares were facing. Think about in episode 2 when the Sutherlands were released, along with Jeremiah and Valletta, the nightmares had a couple updates added to their abilities. The Tristan 1 and the Shinkiro 2 nightmares are 8th generation frames, while the Lancelot 3 is one of the only 2 9th generation frames. The Tristan already had the ability to switch between its humanoid and jet forms, but it had gotten a float system as well, and its MVS polearm was replaced with the 2 severed halves of Galahad's Excalibur. It was renamed the Tristan Divider. The Shinkiro had the ability to turn into a submarine and then go back to its humanoid appearance. The new updates on it were the ability to turn into a jet and double swords slightly longer than Gino's because in the past he had no close-range weapons. It was renamed the Shinkiro Element 4. Lastly was the Lancelot. It was also given the ability to turn into a fast-flying jet and was given swords that could easily rival the Excalibur. The wings had 3 energy feathers and the ability to shoot energy bolts that are strong enough to destroy a nightmare in one hit. It was renamed the Lancelot Albion. The countdown began. They shifted their nightmares into their jet forms. Once the countdown ended, they streaked from the exit doors and out through the sky. They had been given directions by Dumbledore. They were to follow the train tracks to a small village, which they would pass and head for the big castle. When they got there, he told them they had to land on the grass due to the lack of a landing base. They flew low for a moment, stunning the people on the ground before twirling around each other. They went high in the sky, the tracks still clearly visible. After a couple minutes of flying, there was no longer anyone watching the spectacular nightmare pilots, and their path was deserted from any air traffic. Lelouch began to talk to them about what would happen when they got there. All 3 had identical smirks when they began to talk about their grand entrance. Harry walked through the front doors of the Great Hall. He was still surprised that Hermione and Ron hadn't been able to talk to him yet, and he began to wonder what would happen when they did when he heard light footsteps behind him. Without turning around, it was only one person, and so he kept walking across the huge bridge, stopping at the stone circle. He made no move to turn around, so the person behind him said, "Hello," in a voice that Harry couldn't mistaken. Clearly confused, he turned towards the boy. He said uncertainly, and in turn sounded like a question. Draco walked slightly closer. "What's up?" Harry asked, masking his uncertainty. Draco just slightly shook his hair out of his eyes before speaking. "Nothing much. I just came to see the new students arrive. I saw you by yourself and asked myself, why not Draco? But then suddenly millions of reasons why not to popped into my head, so I ignored them." Draco shook back his robe sleeve to reveal an expensive gold, diamond-studded watch. "They should be here in a couple minutes. I wonder what about them makes Dumbledore look so dementedly happy," Harry said thoughtfully as he turned and looked out at the sky. Draco looked at Harry in wonder. "The golden boy doesn't feel so strongly about the leader of the light side?" Draco asked in a mocking tone, but his eyes had a playful glint in them. "Nah. He left me in that place for 11 years before finally getting me out, and now I still have to go every summer even though I have other family," Harry said, his voice filled with disgust. Draco looked slightly shocked. "What do you mean?" Draco asked, and when Harry was silent he continued, "I'm not sure I understand what you said." Once again the blonde was left with no answer, so he tried again. "He left you where?" Harry just shook his head, his eyes filled with hurt and anger at the headmaster. Draco realized how nosy he was being and tried a different approach. "Why don't we go to the spot where these Britannians are supposed to be arriving at?" Harry looked at Draco thankfully, before they headed to the arriving spot of the new students. As they walked, they talked about the different ways the unfamiliar people could be arriving, and they talked about their theories on why the students didn't ride the train with everyone else. 1. Tristan height, 17.88 feet tall / 15.25 meters. 2. Shinkiro height, 15.32 feet tall / 4.67 meters. 3. Lancelot height, 14.73 feet tall / 4.49 meters. For the Shinkiro element is something I made up. The rest are the actual upgrades of the nightmare frames to 8th and 9th generations. I named it the element because of its ability to be in most any element. Land, sky, sea, etc. Review Kitties. The next chapter is almost 3 times as long as this one. Lelouch spoke into his communicator to the Knights of Zero. "I see the village. Let's approach smoothly and observe the surroundings to find the castle that they described." Gino and Suzaku confirmed the thought and slowed down as they approached the village of Hogsmeade. They saw the train station and many people and shops around. The people were staring and pointing at them as they approached. They ignored them for the time being as they looked around for the very obvious castle. They all stared at it for a moment, and Lelouch shuddered as he realized it was about the same size as his mansion he lived in as a child before he was sent to live with Suzaku. Found it, Gino said dryly. They sped up slightly as they approached the giant school. When they got closer, they saw a tall fence. Lelouch remembered something Dumbledore had asked them to do. He had asked them to show some sign that they were approaching so he could take down the wards around the school so they could pass. Lelouch spoke. Slow down, Suzaku, fire the warning to them. We need them to take down the wards for us. Suzaku nodded, and Lelouch saw it through little screens that showed each of their faces to each other. He pressed a couple buttons before pulling a lever. His nightmare jet shifted slightly to reveal the cannon. When one more button was pushed, the cannon fired, and something streaked out in front of them. A couple minutes later, the thing exploded, forming their sign of arrival. Harry was sitting next to Draco on the grass. The lake was shining and glittering brightly. Everyone in Hogwarts was outside, even all the professors and Dumbledore himself. He and Draco were making small talk about their classes they looked forward, ones they didn't, but nothing too personal. They weren't ready to tell each other their life stories yet. Suddenly a loud crack was heard, and something was whizzing through the air above the forbidden forest. Everyone watched it speed towards them before it went right above the lake, where it in turn exploded into fireworks in the unfamiliar shape of the sign of Britannia. Dumbledore waved his wand in the air, and the air above the gates shimmered slightly, the only physical sign that the wards had been taken down. Lelouch noticed this and said, "He has taken them down, we can go through now." Gino, Suzaku, and Lelouch sped up towards the gates. There's still about a minute before they would even be visible to the students. They spoke quietly, reviewing the plan when they arrived quickly. Lelouch straightened his collar with one hand, before determinedly prepared to shift. Suzaku and Gino mirrored his actions almost completely. Harry watched as everyone whispered loudly after the fireworks ended. Suddenly someone yelled, "I see something, over that way," and pointed the way the fireworks had been shot off from. In the distance was 3 dots, one black and gold, one white and gold, and the other white, blue and red. They were just blobs for a moment before they got close enough for students to realize what they looked like. They were small jets and were extremely fast. They flew above the students and took a quick loop around the entire castle. They were so fast it took less than a minute to do so. They were in a triangle formation with the black jet in the front, and flanking it was the 2 white ones on either side. During their loop, they had descended so they were about only 60 feet above the ground. They slowed down as they reached the students again. They went right in front of the students and the turn so they were facing the students, hovering for a couple seconds. Suddenly the jets started to shift. They shifted smoothly and flawlessly in beautiful sync. In the place of the 3 jets were 3 humanoid machines. They suddenly had brightly colored wings from the back to hold them aloft, and they slowly sank to the ground. When they touched the ground, everyone seemed to snap out of the dreamlike state they had been reduced to in the impressive performance. Dumbledore was the first to move, and he strolled almost casually towards the tall human-like machines. A strange hiss-like sound came from the nightmares as the hatch slid open. All 3 stood in sync, and still unseen from the crowd, they dropped the lines they used to get off the nightmares. They all descended smoothly, shocking the already shocked crowd. The pilot from the black and gold machine was obviously higher in ranking than the others. He had slightly long brown hair that went to about his chin. His purple eyes dazzled the crowd of girls, yet showed no emotion. The pilot from the white, red, yellow, and blue one was the tallest. He had blonde hair that flipped out slightly and bright green eyes that shone with excitement. The other pilot was from the white and gold machine. His brown hair was wavy, and about the same length as the other. He had bright blue eyes that scanned the crowd for any enemies. All 3 of their outfits were made of the finest materials, and their matching outfits, aside from the colored capes, really added to the effect. The witches and wizards were completely shocked at the beauty of these foreign students. They all walked gracefully towards the headmaster, who shook hands with each of them. "Welcome to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I hope you enjoy your schooling here. Now, if you would be so kind as to follow me to my office where we will talk about your schedules." The purple-eyed boy spoke up in a powerful tone, meaning business. Should we just leave our nightmares here then? I am fine with that as long as nothing is stole and nobody touches them. It seems everyone wants a closer look at them anyway. Several girls giggled and whispered to each other. Dumbledore nodded, before walking back to the castle, with the 3 Britannians following behind him. As soon as they were out of earshot, everyone burst out talking at the same time. Several professors walked up to the unfamiliar machines, making sure that the students didn't touch the expensive equipment. Draco turned to Harry when Harry spoke. Wonder how easy Quidditch would be with those. He half mumbled. Draco couldn't help it and burst out laughing. After seeing something like that, that was what he said. Harry looked at Draco for a minute before he had to join the laughter. Draco really did have a nice laugh, but he didn't share it with just anyone. Slowly they stood and headed back up to the castle. With a small wave from each boy, they split ways. Draco heading for the dungeons, Harry the library. Harry got about 10 minutes of studying done before he was rudely interrupted by the 2 people he didn't want to see. Hermione slammed her hand on the table before snarling. What's wrong with you, Harry? You've been ignoring us. I can't believe you. You're acting like a traitor, hanging out with the snakes, changing your style, you're acting all dark all of a sudden. She was almost yelling when she finished. Ron continued her rant as she took a deep breath. Yeah, I mean, what up with the new look? Ron started to yell, causing the people around to look at them in surprise. Where your glasses and your clothing style is different. I mean to say, Ron seemed to visibly struggle to be nice to his friend. We miss you, mate. We want our Harry back. The librarian looked at them sternly before shushing them. Harry began to pack up his books, and Hermione noticed this. She yelled, Harry, don't you think about leaving? We aren't done talking to you. She seemed to be fuming, and Harry had enough. Well, as you can see, I am done talking to you, Harry said in a deadly calm voice, causing Hermione and Ron to recoil for a moment before Hermione opened her mouth to continue, but Harry moved quickly and was out of the room before she was even able to screech anything at the boy who lived. Lelouch was almost panting by the time they reached the headmaster's office. He sniffed and looked the other way as he saw Suzaku grinning cheekily at his obvious lack of stamina. They took seats in the crowded office. Lelouch noticed the beautiful red phoenix in the back corner. Dumbledore sat down and put his elbows on his desk, leaning forward to rest his chin on them. He seemed to look each boy over before speaking. I have schedules made for you 3 already. Tonight you will be sorted into your houses. The houses are, but he was cut off by the Emperor of Britannia. Gryffindor for the brave and courageous, Ravenclaw for the smart and thoughtful, Slytherin for the cunning and sneaky, and Hufflepuff for the losers who don't fit in the others, I guess. I never really grasped what the Hufflepuff kids are good for, Lelouch said thoughtfully, causing Gino to snort. Suzaku shook his head in amusement. Dumbledore chose to ignore the last comment and chose a different topic. Now, I would like to know why you 3 were chosen to come here. Also, if one of you is in charge of the others, I will need to know that for schedules and stuff. Lelouch saw Suzaku and Gino look at each other before looking at Lelouch. They had already chosen how to go by it. Well, you see, I am close to the Emperor of Britannia, Lelouch smirked inwardly, knowing that Dumbledore didn't know how literally he meant that. And he chose me to go. In Britannia, the important people chose a knight as basically a bodyguard. Well, I, being a greedy little bastard, chose 2 knights, Lelouch said, ignoring the headmaster's tutoring of language. Dumbledore nodded and waited to see if any of them had anything to add. None of them said anything. Well, why don't I give you a rundown of all the professors and classes? Then we can go to the Great Hall for dinner and your house sorting. At their confirming nod, he started with the teachers. Harry was sitting at the Gryffindor table with some 6th and 7th year kids. He felt more comfortable with them than the rest of his house, aside from Neville, who was also present beside Harry. He ignored the glares that were coming from his previous best friends. On the other side of the Great Hall was Draco. He was sitting with Blaise, Pansy, and Theodore, talking and laughing comfortably. Suddenly all the houses grew quiet as Dumbledore raised his hands. Now, I know most of you are aware of the 3 Britannia students that arrived today. Well, why don't we give them a warm Hogwarts welcome? The Gryffindors, Hufflepuffs, and Ravenclaws clapped happily, while the Slytherins clapped half-heartedly. The three newest students walked out of the shadows by the great hall entrance doors. They walked seeming quite comfortable being in the center spotlight. The blonde even waved to a couple of the more eager students. When they reached the headmaster, they talked for a moment. Then Dumbledore raised his hands for silence. When he got it, he spoke loudly. Now, these boys have agreed to let the Sorting Hat speak and think out loud, so you might get to know them a little better. Now, if you wish to begin. He gestured for Professor McGonagall to start. She pulled out a piece of paper with only 3 names on it. Kururugi, Suzaku, she said, her voice ringing sharp and clear through the silence of the great hall. The brunette with green eyes walked forward and sat down onto the stool. He shook the hair out of his face with a shake of his head, a determined look on his face. The hall was silent before the hat's voice boomed across the hall. Wow, we have a brave one here, don't we? But you have had your fair share of heartbreak and betrayal. If anyone looked at the purple-eyed boy, they would see immense sorrow and guilt flash across his usually guarded face before masking himself again. I think they will be glad to have you. Gryffindor, the hat yelled, and the red and gold table rose, clapping madly and nudging each other, exchanging words drowned out by the clapping. Suzaku waited until they sat down to join his new house, and after surveying the groups, went and sat down next to Harry. They shook hands and introduced themselves, and Harry was mildly surprised and happy when he didn't freak at the name Harry Potter. Then McGonagall got the hall quiet once again and lifted the list to read of the second name. Lamperouche, Lelouch, the black-haired, purple-eyed boy stepped forward. He walked in front of the stool, and with one hand he swept his hair out of his eyes as he sat down. The hat was on his head, and the hat gasped loudly. You, my dear boy, have the most horrible past I have ever seen. Your hands aren't exactly clean either. With your brains you could easily be placed in Ravenclaw, but that isn't your fate, for you have far greater, even scarier talents than your intelligence. You are one in mind, soul, and body. Slytherin. The Sorting Hat's choice was awarded with loud cheering from the snake pit. Lelouch sauntered over to the Slytherin table and sat alone, but after a moment was surrounded by all the students in his new house. Draco just smirked at him from his place, and earned a smirk and a nod right back. Gino Weinberg. McGonagall announced the final transfer students, and the girls all struggled to memorize the difficult names. The blonde smiled at her and walked over to the stool. He sat down, and the hat was placed on his head as well. The hat seemed to look thoughtful for a moment before speaking. You are not a lot like you companions, yet you all share horrible pasts. Now with you courage you should defiantly be a Gryffindor, but you also have a little of that Slytherin quality. You remind me a lot of the Weasley twins. At those words, whoops were heard from the twin red heads at the Gryffindor table, causing some people to laugh, and some people to groan. They already had enough on their plate with those tricksters. Gino looked slightly unsure of whether that was supposed to be a compliment or not. The hat continued, overall though, you shine in one of those two more so than the other. Gryffindor, the hat yelled. Once again the Gryffindor table erupted in applause. Gino looked at Lelouch almost sadly before brightening and walking over to his other best friend. He sat down next to Suzaku and proceeded to gawk along with him as food appeared on the table. They watched in fascination as the students around them began eating as though that happened every day. Harry noticed them and decided to wake them out of their dream like haze by inviting them to dig in like everyone else was, causing the closer Gryffindors to laugh. Over at the Slytherin table, Lelouch wasn't surprised when the food appeared. He, unlike his friends, had actually thoroughly read Hogwarts, a history. The people that had swarmed around him had dissipated slightly. He sat silently as many people introduced themselves. He basically ignored them as much as possible, and made sure to use his manners at the table, aside from the obvious fact that it is rude to ignore people at meals. At the end of the dinner, he was surprised when the blonde boy who smirked at him earlier sat down next to him. He was expecting him to introduce himself, but instead he said, slightly exasperated. But Lelouch knew it wasn't because him. It seems you're going to be bunking with me. Normally I have my own private room, but it seems that none are available. So whenever you want to head to the common room, I'm ready. He walked back over to the people he was sitting with before. One was a small skinny girl with a lot of makeup on. She kept making kissy faces at Draco, and he scowled crossly at her. The other two were both boys, one was dark-skinned, the other almost as pale as the extra pale blonde. /N, I'm gonna play around with Theodore Knott's look a little bit. I don't remember what he looks like exactly. After a couple more minutes, he walked over to the blonde. He tapped his shoulder and Lelouch said with an air of pride, "Are you ready now?" He said it as though he was the one waiting for the other boy to finish his meal, not the other way around. Then he rose and they both walked out of the great hall. Lelouch was the first to speak. "I never caught your name." The blonde smirked and said, "That's because I never said it."
I'm Draco Malfoy.
He held out his hand for Lelouch to shake. Lelouch introduced himself and they shook. He followed Malfoy into the dungeons and finally to a blank slab of wall that Malfoy said was called the blank slab of wall, went around other students. Lelouch held back a chuckle while Malfoy said the password, /N. Like I would tell you screaming fans the password to the Slytherin common room. Heck, they won't tell me. Tongue sticking out. He led Lelouch past the common room and into their room. Draco mumbled something under his breath that sounded like, "Welcome to your home away from home," before walking over to his bags. Lelouch walked over to the small dog crate Sarah was in. He hadn't fed her in a while. Lelouch woke up feeling restless. Glancing across the room, he saw his unfamiliar blonde roommate shuffling through the trunk at the bottom of his bed. Searching for a moment, his eyes lit up as he found what he was looking for, and his hand moved faster. Holding it triumphantly above his suitcase, he made a small noise of happiness. Draco was surprised when a quiet chuckle sounded from across the room. Turning, he was remembered that he was no longer alone in his room, and almost blushed in embarrassment. Lelouch shook his head in slight amusement before carefully swinging his legs over the edge of his bed. Draco realized that his roommate was about to start changing and went to step out of the room. "You don't have to leave while I change. I'm not shy," Lelouch said, smirking. He was answered with the famous Malfoy sneer. "I'm not leaving for you," he said snidely, though it didn't hold its usual rudeness. "I'll just wait out in the common room for you then." And with that, the Malfoy air was gone. Lelouch shook his head in amusement and proceeded to change into the unfamiliar black robes. His was different from the others, though. While the Slytherin patch was placed on his left shoulder, on his back was the sign of Britannia. He also assumed that the same was with his knights, aside from they would have Gryffindor patches. Walking into the common room, he saw Draco leaning casually against the wall. Lelouch walked up to him, and with a nod from the other boy they headed to breakfast. When they reached the great hall, Lelouch's eyes searched the large room for his knights. When he saw them, his normally stone-like eyes softened a bit, before becoming hard again. Draco noticed the small gesture of fondness and internally smiled. All Slytherins had a soft spot somewhere. His eyes searched for a green-eyed Gryffindor at the thought. "Wait, what?" he thought before shaking it off. "Hey, Draco?" asked Lelouch, shaking the boy from his thoughts. "Is there any rules about where to sit at?" he asked, glancing back at the Gryffindor table every few seconds. Draco shrugged. "Does it matter?" he asked, smirking. "Every rule here was practically made for us Slytherins to break one way or another." Lelouch nodded in amusement of the blonde's reasoning. Walking over to the Gryffindor table, he was only slightly surprised to see said blonde following him. When he went to one side of the table, he circled and went to the other. Standing behind the oblivious Knights of Britannia, Lelouch coughed rather dramatically and was amused at how fast the two spun around, Suzaku even choking on the tea he had been drinking. "Any room for two, perhaps?" Lelouch asked. Suzaku and Gino smiled at their emperor and each moved in opposite direction, leaving room for him in the middle. "Wait, you said room for two?" Harry asked from across the table. "What got a problem with me sitting here, Harry?" Draco asked in mock horror as he sat down in the vacant seat next to said boy who lived. Harry shook his head after the shock of the Slytherin prince sitting willingly at the Gryffindor table. Everyone dug in happily to the filling meal, except for Lelouch, who more or less just pushed the food around on his plate, making it look like he had eaten his fill. Suzaku looked warningly at Lelouch for his lack of appetite, but Lelouch just waved him off. "I'm not hungry anyway," he said to the worried knights. Quiet conversation filled the room, when suddenly everyone fell silent. Gino slowly stopped talking and looked around in confusion. An unfamiliar red-headed boy and a brunette girl were standing behind the three Britannians. Lelouch stood and Suzaku and Gino stood cautiously after him. So the redhead began, sneering. "These people are who you ditched up for?" He walked up to Lelouch and reached to poke him in the chest as he continued to speak. "Slimy Slytherins, go run along with the other Death Eaters, you pieces of shit." His finger was a mere centimeter from touching Lelouch when a smack was heard across the hall. Lelouch retracted his hand and smirked. Ron looked furious as he clutched his hand. "Stupid pretty boy," he yelled, and without thinking he swung his fist forward to connect with that pretty boy's face. In a matter of seconds Gino had grabbed Ron's fist and twisted it behind his back. In his other hand his gun was pressed to the boy's throat. Gino's hold on his arm tightened as time went by. Everyone was frozen until Ron let out a whimper. Lelouch smirked as he spoke. Now, Gino. Be gentle with the boy. He didn't know what he was doing." Gino smirked and let the redhead go. Ron stumbled away from them, shaking in fear. "What are you?" he asked, stumbling backwards before clambering up and out of the hall. The brown-haired girl quickly followed, eyeing the trio disdainfully. As soon as the pair left, everyone started talking at the same time, voicing their opinion on the matter. Lelouch, Gino, and Suzaku sat back down, almost as though nothing had happened. Harry and Draco looked from the door to each other before bursting out laughing. "I think I rather like Draco's laugh," Harry thought to himself, vowing to make him laugh a top priority. After a few minutes everyone calmed down a bit. Harry and Draco proposed they head out to the Quidditch pitch. Planning to meet in roughly half an hour, the group split to go to their respective common rooms. Once there, Draco and Lelouch grabbed their brooms and Lelouch grabbed Sarah. Grabbing her collar and leash, Lelouch carried her as he walked with Draco to the Quidditch field. Along the way, Lelouch answered Draco's questions about the Beast of Darthmore and Sarah in particular, and about halfway out of the dungeon Sarah was handed off to Draco, who was, admittedly, a dog person. As soon as they stepped outside, Sarah started to squirm in Draco's arms. Grabbing her from Draco, Lelouch snapped her leash on her collar and set her down on the grass. Along the way Sarah tried to sneak away several times, only to be busted when the leash way almost yanked from Lelouch's hands. Once they reached the pitch they found that Harry, Suzaku, Gino, Fong, and Tatiana were already there. As soon as they were in sight, Lelouch unclipped Sarah's leash and allowed her to run up to the other puppies. After watching the trio of pups roll around on the grass for a few seconds, Lelouch and Draco made their way to stand next to the Gryffindors. After getting basic flying lessons from Harry and Draco, the Britannians decided to try flying. Gino was a natural-born flyer. Whether it was from him piloting the Tristan, the first flying nightmare capable of transforming, or just luck, they didn't know. Suzaku was also pretty good at flying. He and Gino soared across the sky while Lelouch was still struggling to handle being on his broom higher than 20 feet, let alone the 50 to 100 feet high area that the other two boys were in. Draco and Harry smirked at each other as Harry pulled out a snitch from his pocket. Letting it go, the two mounted their brooms and counted to 3. 1, 2, and the two boys shot off like rockets, eager to win and show off to each other. Gino and Suzaku started to try to flip when they noticed a shaky Lelouch fly up to them. "Don't know that I like this," Lelouch mumbled, angry that he wasn't as good as the other two. The Knights of Zero chuckled good-heartedly at the completely unathletic pretty boy. Both their smiles fell as Lelouch started to rock back and forth shakily, and before they could reach him, he slipped off his broom. Both automatically going into soldier mode, Draco and Harry could only watch as the boys worked together almost naturally to save the brunette. Gino sped towards the ground while Suzaku went straight for Lelouch. Gino hopped off his broom and held his arms out to catch the boy if Suzaku couldn't. Lelouch's eyes were wide and panicky, and he reached his arm out to Suzaku. With one hand on his broom, Suzaku grabbed Lelouch with his other and pulled him onto his broom smoothly. Lelouch's legs straddled the broom, but he was facing Suzaku's chest. Suzaku quickly wrapped a muscled arm around Lelouch's chest and held him tightly, fearing he would fall if he let go. Carefully going downwards, he landed and immediately picked Lelouch up and set him on the ground. Both Gino and Suzaku swarmed over him, checking to see that their emperor was all right. Draco and Harry had landed and were holding back the three puppies to keep them from going to the distressed trio. "I'm fine, guys," Lelouch said, smiling at the motherly pair. Before he knew it, Gino tackled him, so he landed with a loud oof. It was then that Lelouch realized that Gino was hugging him, and he slowly put his arms around the larger boy. Suzaku stood to the side, smiling at the pair before diving in on top of them. They wrestled for a moment before they all stopped at the same time. Gino was lying on the ground with Lelouch straddling him. Suzaku had his arms wrapped around Lelouch's waist, his head on his shoulder, his chest practically touching Lelouch's back. They then realized how compromising their positions looked and blushed deeply. Lelouch turned his head and froze, realizing just how close Suzaku's face was to his. Time seemed to have frozen until Fong escaped from Harry's arms and bounded over to the trio, licking Gino's face. Suzaku quickly stood with Lelouch following. Suzaku reached out his hand for Gino to grab and pulled the bigger boy up. Gino winked at Suzaku when Lelouch turned around. Maybe their plan would work after all. Lelouch stepped into the potions classroom and looked around. The seating arrangements were groups of 3 that shared lab tables. Walking gracefully, he went to the front rows of desks and sat down in the middle of the 3 seats. Scraping of the stool beside him alerted him that people were sitting next to him. Turning, he saw Gino on one side, grinning ear to ear at him. On his other side, Suzaku grumbled about his bag as he slung it on the floor. Lelouch leaned forward lazily and rested his chin on his hand as he scanned the board. It read simple instructions to choose your seat carefully, because the people you sit with can doom you or can ensure your success. Once Lelouch finished with that, his eyes scanned the room to see seating arrangements. This class was a shared class of all the houses, with quite a few Ravenclaws, 2 Hufflepuffs, the majority of the class Slytherins, and a handful of Gryffindors. This class was the only 5th year for potions, and it was for people who passed last year. The only reason the Britannians were in this class was because the headmaster wanted them to get a variety of classes in, and Snape didn't fight too hard against it. Speaking of the snarky potions professor, everyone in the room except Draco, Suzaku, and Lelouch jumped when he burst through the door, said door slamming against the wall. Lelouch chuckled lightly at Gino's freaked-out expressions and nudged him with his elbow jokingly for jumping so high. Gino stuck his tongue out at the Emperor, causing the young man to blush deeply at thoughts of what better use that tongue could have before turning away to look at Professor Snape. "Can someone tell me what the Wolfsbane potion is?" Snape said, black eyes scanning the room for prey. His eyes finally landed on the only Britannian in his House of Slytherin, who had his hand almost leisurely in the air. "Yes, Mr. Lamperouge?" Snape asked warily, knowing off the 3 boys' lack of knowledge of anything to do with spells, potions, and magical creatures. But he was still curious to see what his interesting new student thought. "The Wolfsbane potion is a complex potion that relieves some symptoms of lycanthropy. Although it does not completely cure the infected witch or wizard, if taken once every day during the last week before the full moon, it will allow the witch or wizard to keep their mind, per se, during the transformation and not let the beast inside take over. It allows them to control their actions to eliminate harm to people around them," Lelouch said before blinking slowly. A smirk appeared on his head of house's lips, and the professor praised the boy. "Very good, Lelouch. 20 points for Slytherin," he said smoothly before continuing. "Now who can tell me the main ingredient in the Wolfsbane potion?" Before he could choose someone, Lelouch spoke. "The main ingredient is a plant called Wolfsbane. It is less commonly referred to as aconite or monkshood." Snape nodded, pleased, before saying, 10 points to Slytherin. "Now can you tell me what the completed potion looks like?" Lelouch opened his mouth to speak, but a female voice rushed before him. "It should mist a light blue color, with a blue base color and swirls of purple, is what the actual potions itself looks like." Everyone turned to look at the bushy-haired girl in the back of the class, obviously upset someone else was taking all the attention for being smart when it was usually only her. "You are not to speak without being called upon, Granger. 10 points from Gryffindor," he said before turning to the board to start writing up the instructions to creating the potion. "But Professor," Hermione started to complain about his biased behavior toward the Slytherin Emperor, when Snape turned toward her, a dangerous glint in his eye. Lelouch smirked at this. I wonder which side of the war he's on. I'll issue a background report later, Lelouch thought. Wouldn't want to be on his bad side. He mentally chuckled. Snape sauntered to the table Hermione was sitting at and leaned dangerously toward her. Must I repeat myself? He asked coolly, scaring the 3 Gryffindors sitting at the table worse than if he had been yelling. 10 points from Gryffindor for disrespecting your teacher. And with that he walked back to the board. Waving his wand, his neat script appeared on the board with instructions on the potion. We will be working on this potion for the next week. You will complete until here for today before leaving a warming spell on it until class tomorrow. Remember, if you mess up you won't have time to restart. When some of you idiots do screw up and or cause your potion to explode, I will expect a foot long every day until the due date. The essay should explain what you did wrong, if you can even figure out that, and what would happen to someone if they were to take it instead of a successfully completed potion. This caused loud groans to go across the classroom, as many of the students weren't good with longer potions. Snape then told everyone to go ahead by house and collect the ingredients. Lelouch and Gino decided to collect the necessary ingredients from the cabinet. Snape told the Slytherins to go first, therefore able to get the best ingredients. Lelouch led the way with the rest of the Slytherins. Looking at the list, he looked around grabbing the necessary. Every few minutes Gino would show him something and Lelouch would either tell him it was correct for the potion or not. Lelouch had been looking for the last ingredient for a while, the wolfsbane itself, and finally spotted it on the top shelf. Stretching up with his only free arm, he was about a half a foot too short to reach. Then he nearly jumped when he felt a warm body against his back and looked up to see the familiar head of blonde hair of Gino. Gino easily reached vial over Lelouch's back and smiled down at him, holding out the vial. Don't be difficult and ask for help when you need it. He reprimanded lightly, and to his surprise, he noticed Lelouch's face had turned a light pink from his blush. Gino laughed before heading back to their seat, aware that Lelouch's blush hadn't been because of being helpless but from Gino himself. Lelouch shivered as his back suddenly felt cold from the lack of Gino, but Lelouch shook his head before walking over and dumping the ingredients, carefully dash. While Gino and Lelouch had been gone, Suzaku had gone ahead and started boiling the water that was required and had gotten all the tools needed to cut, grind, and squeeze said ingredients. The trio worked diligently, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Harry and Draco were a team of 2, and their potion was coming along quite nicely, as was his own. Turning back, he focused on the potion again. He didn't need to screw up the potion for everyone. Looking over at his partners, he saw that Gino and Suzaku were both looking at him. When they noticed him looking, they both turned a light shade of pink as they turned back to their work, which was Gino chopping up roots and with Suzaku carefully stirring. Lelouch looked between them in confusion before going back to squeezing juice out of a bright beetle. Something was going on in his knights' minds. Lelouch didn't know what it was, but he knew he'd figure it out. He was confident in his ability to figure out equations and plan battles, so figuring out what those 2 plotting about wouldn't be too hard. Too bad he didn't think it had anything to do with himself. /n. Sorry for the lack of any plot so far. The next chapter will skip a month or 2 into the future, so I can bring in a couple of my favorite Code Geass characters and show off Lulu a little bit. Expect some flashes into Voldemort's take on the new students as well. The next chapter should be longer than this one to make up for its shortness. 733 people have read this story in the past 5 days. Yay. And only 3 reviews? That means 99.7% of you are not reviewing. I won't demand them, but keep even the small updates soon. Reviews keep me going. Now off I go to finish writing the next chapter. Thanks for reading and review my kitties. Waves wildly and then glomps Snape. Are you Cuddle Bunny, Sevi Weavy? Your Highness. We just received a letter from the Emperor. A high-ranked soldier told the newest Prince of Britannia. Rollo looked up, his violet eyes widening as he gestured the soldier to come forward. He came forward and handed the prince his letter. Rollo hastily opened while dismissing the soldier. He hadn't heard from his big brother since he left, and he was almost desperate to hear from him. His eyes scanned the neat cursive of Lelouch and his eyes widened. After reading it once, he proceeded to read it again. reading carefully to check for any sign that it was a fake Lelouch who wrote it. Not finding anything, Rollo quickly called in the nearest guard. "Find Knight Luciano and bring him here," Rollo ordered, his head buzzing in excitement. He paced back and forth across his room before he heard his door open, then close. In walked a man with orange hair spiked straight up, with a red streak down each side and a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He looked badass, and how he got into the Knights of the Round no one knew until they saw him in a nightmare frame, battling it out and dealing the pain. As he walked in, his orange Knight of the Round cape flowed behind him in cascades, until he came to a stop at Rollo's desk. "You called Rollo?" he asked, not bothering with formalities. He was never one to abide with calling everyone Highness and Sir. He just said what he wants to, respectfully or not. He flicked his cigarette into the ashtray on Rollo's desk, put there for his frequent visits. "I received a letter from Lelouch. Here, read it," Rollo said excitedly. Luciano rolled his eyes affectionately at his unusually childlike behavior. Luciano began to half-read it out loud as he read it. "Everything's going as expected," he mumbled a little bit, still unsure of sides. Some more mumbling went on. "We need some extra help." Rollo had walked around to the other side of his desk to stand next to the confused knight. "Silence. What the hell?" Luciano asked as he eyed the paper warily. Rollo shook his head and snatched the paper out of the taller boy's hands. "He wants us to go and help him. We are to enroll at Hogwarts to help him both protect himself and find out some inside information that only I can get." Rollo summed up the final paragraph of the letter in 2 sentences. "So we're going to this magical world?" Luciano asked, and after Rollo nodded, he whistled lowly. Luciano mumbled something and Rollo frowned slightly. "What was that, my knight?" Rollo asked. Luciano smirked and stepped closer to Rollo, causing said prince to step back as well. "I said," Luciano said with a grin like a Cheshire cat and stepped forward again. "I think step. You need another step. To convince me." Rollo's back was against the wall and he looked up at him. Luciano braced one arm above Rollo's head and dipped his head down. His lips were almost touching Rollo's as he spoke. Rollo's eyes widened before he spoke. "Are you sure?" he asked playfully, darting out his tongue to brush against Luciano's lip. "Yes, your highness," Luciano purred before connecting his mouth with his prince's, earning a moan of approval from the younger boy. The Knight of 10 picked up Rollo without breaking contacts with their lips and walked to the other side of the room to toss him roughly on his bed. Smirking, he crawled on the bed to tower over smaller boys smirking at him, and their mouths met again, tongues exploring. Submissive moans from newest Prince of Britannia and possessive growls coming from the Vampire of Britannia filled the air. The guards outside looked at each other, shifting awkwardly. They winced simultaneously as a rather loud moan was heard from the room, causing them to look, embarrassed, away from the door and each other. Back at Hogwarts, Harry led the way out the Great Hall. Once in the entrance hall, he turned to the group. "Why don't we go hang out in the Gryffindor common room?" Harry asked, looking at everyone. The other 2 Gryffindors nodded while the 2 Slytherins looked hesitant. "Why would I want to go there?" Draco sneered, but it didn't hold its usual amount of disgust. Lelouch eyed Draco and Harry warily. "Oh, come on, it'll be fine," Gino urged on. Suzaku and Harry nodded in agreement. Finally Draco relented and the 2 Slytherin boys followed the Gryffindors as they walked up the now familiar, but still unpredictable, moving staircases. They finally reached the top floor and Suzaku led the way to the portrait of the fat lady. He quickly muttered the password, and other than the fat lady looking at the Slytherins curiously, she let them pass. Once inside, Lelouch was almost instantly reminded of his childhood with Nunnally at the mansion, before his mother died. Pushing back the memories, he followed through the hallways to the actual common room. Once inside, the crowded room grew silent. Everyone was looking at Lelouch and Draco warily, before noticing Gino and Suzaku and feeling slightly better. Suzaku and Gino had been friendly people and easy to get along with. As long as they were there, it wouldn't matter if their Slytherin best friend was too. Not even a minute had passed before an angry red head stood up from the table he had been sitting at. He made his way over to Lelouch, a deep frown on his face. "What makes you think you can be in here? Snakes?" He spat, looking from Lelouch to Draco. Draco glared back hard, but Lelouch easily put on a friendly mask. "Oh, I'm just here with my friends to hang out," he said with a smile. Internally he wanted to slap the weasel in the face, but he had to put on an act first. "Get out before you get your ass handed to you," he ground out, stepping closer. Out of the corner of his eye, Lelouch noticed that where the annoying redhead had been sitting there was a chess set. Smirking, Lelouch focused back on the redhead. "How about we play some chess on it?" Lelouch asked, Gino and Suzaku smiling at each other behind them. At Ron's confused look, Lelouch continued, talking in a slow manner, as if he was talking to a small child. "I assume you know how to play chess. Well, we should play on it. I win. Both Draco and I have free access here without you bothering us." Ron looked as though he had just won the lottery. He must be pretty confident. Lelouch thought, "If I win, you don't get any access to the Gryffindor common room. Also, you have to be my servant for a week," Ron said, happy with his master plan. Gino and Suzaku bristled at the thought of their emperor having to follow the every whim of this thing. But they both knew of Lelouch's ability of commanding both soldiers and chess pieces to perfection. "It's a deal," Lelouch said, and they shook on it. They then made their way over to the chess table, which had been placed in the middle of the common room, a plush seat on either side. "Why does it feel like one of those trips to the Playboy mansions I used to take when I went to Ashford?" "That's right. Last time I went I was with Rollo," Lelouch thought, a small smile on his face at the thought of his now adopted brother. Gino, Suzaku, Harry, and Draco made their way and stood around Lelouch. Everyone else in the common room congregated around the chessboard to see the unusual match. Those few who looked at Lelouch were slightly frightened at the smirk on his face before disappearing so fast they thought they saw wrong. Ron waved his wand and the pieces assembled in the correct places. Ron smirked before confidently saying, "You get first move." Lelouch smirked before calling his king to attention. Everyone in the room looked at the young emperor in confusion. Ron was the one to speak his objection, laughing. "Are you stupid? Do you really think you can start and win with your king?" Ron laughed again. Lelouch smiled to himself before turning his gaze to the laughing redhead. The serious expression on his face was eerie and silenced the Weasley. "If the king does not lead, his subordinates will not follow. In a mansion somewhere outside of Hogwarts, my lord, the students from Britannia are improving faster in magic than we thought would ever be possible," a black-haired man said as he crouched low to the ground at his lord's feet. The room was empty except for the two. "Stand, Severus, we are alone. Rise and face me," said the voice, and Severus stood to face the tall male. Standing in front of the snarky professor was the Dark Lord himself. Voldemort stood at a proud 6'8", towering over every one of his followers except his werewolf snatcher Fenrir Greyback. The Dark Lord and Snape were both silent for a moment, before Voldemort spoke again. "We must figure out a way to introduce us. They sound like a powerful bunch." Snape smirked, then spoke quickly, eager to please his master. "I have snuck into Dumbledore's office to check his notes on the Britannians to see if he knew anything we didn't." Voldemort told him to continue. "Apparently they are pretty high in ranking in Britannia. There are two in particular he knew the most about. They are the two Gryffindors Suzaku Kururugi and Gino Weinberg. It says they are among the top fighters in the nation and they are both honorary knights of the round." He paused for a moment before continuing. "They both survived the war that was resolved around 6 months ago with Japan, who were called 11s versus Britannia. What I found strange that both were sided with Britannia." At Voldemort's confused glance, Snape hurriedly elaborated. "Suzaku was an 11. Voldemort stood, looking thoughtfully at the ground. "What did Dumbledore find out about the Slytherin student?" Voldemort asked. All he had reported was that Lelouch Lamperouge was a quiet boy who didn't talk too much about his past in Britannia. All he knew about him was that both Suzaku and Gino have sworn their loyalty to him and would gladly die to save his life. Severus continued. "What is your opinion on the boy?" Voldemort asked, not sure to judge the boy on something the headmaster said. Snape was taken aback that the Dark Lord wanted his opinion. Usually nobody got in a word, no matter the subject, on something as important as this. "Well, my lord, I personally think he is extremely well-mannered to anyone he sees as a friend, but he can be extremely quick to block someone out if they do something wrong. I also feel that he is not as innocent as he seems, for I saw the way he has acted toward Ron Weasley. Weasley got on his bad side when he arrived, and he has been extremely cunning so far, I think. Snape said, careful not to talk too much in fear that his master might take back what he said. Voldemort smirked at Severus' words. His smirk got bigger as he began to think of his plan to get them on his side. It would work, that he was sure. Now only when to put the plan in action. /N. Thanks for reviewing. I got 8 reviews this time, which was twice as much as last time. I don't mind if you leave reviews without logging in. If you don't have an account or are too lazy to log in me, just review anonymously. Review my kitties. Let's go of choke hold on Severus. Come on, let's keep writing. Sev. Lelouch sat down in the plush chair next to the roaring fire. Leaning back, he folded one leg over his other. Lifting up one hand to his face, he brushed his hair to the side, ignoring the glare he was getting from a certain redhead on the opposite side of the room. Finally sneaking a glance at said redhead, he saw the boy break yet another quill in frustration, his eyes never leaving Lelouch. Lelouch slowly turned back to look at the fire, and was slightly surprised when he heard a familiar voice. He's just upset he lost, is all. Harry said, hesitantly sitting next to the other brunette. He had become good friends with Gino and Suzaku, and even though he was on the road to becoming a loyal friend to Lelouch, the process was slower with the colder boy. Lelouch smiled at him and laughed. I know, I kind of think it's funny. Harry joined in with his own laugh. They stopped laughing after a minute, and Harry finally completely relaxed. They sat for a moment, comfortable silence filling the air until Harry spoke. At first I couldn't believe you actually beat Ron, Harry said, smiling brightly. Lelouch looked at him in confusion. At first? Lelouch asked. Well, a couple seconds after you first started, I could tell you knew you were going to win. It was as though you knew exactly what he was going to do. You're a tactical genius, Lelouch, Harry said, and then glanced over at Ron. As soon as I noticed this, I knew he was going down. Lelouch smiled genuinely at him, able to understand his sadness when he talked about Ron. He too had been betrayed, many of times at that, and knew no words of comfort could help the boy who lived. He would have to slowly heal himself, much like Lelouch had done. Lelouch was startled out of his dark thoughts as Harry stood. Patting Lelouch on the shoulder, he said, "Good win, you deserved it." He then walked over to the entrance to the boys' dormitory, waving goodnight to Draco, Suzaku, and Gino, who were standing together, then walked up the staircase. Lelouch suddenly was reminded of Rollo by the way Harry sometimes acted. Thinking back, he remembered that the boy and Luciano would be arriving for dinner. Lelouch turned back to the fire and was once pulled from his thoughts as Draco came to sit down in the same spot Harry had been, glaring at Lelouch. "Is something wrong?" Lelouch asked Draco slowly, hoping he wasn't opening a new can of worms. Draco scowled at him for a moment before speaking angrily. "Nothing, but it seems everything is fine with you and Harry." He made sure to make his tone slightly suggestive so Lelouch would understand what he meant. Draco was jealous of Lelouch for talking to Harry? Lelouch started laughing and Draco momentarily forgot his anger for a second, looking at Lelouch in confusion. Then he remembered he was angry at the Emperor and started to glare again. "What's so funny?" Draco sneered. After a second more of just Lelouch laughing, Draco said louder, "Stop laughing." Lelouch quickly sobered up and turned lock eyes with Draco. "I wasn't hitting on Harry, Draco. I know you like him and I wouldn't do that to you. God, I thought you trusted me more than that." Lelouch teased lightly. Draco visibly sagged with relief, but then realized what he had just admitted. Blushing a deep red, Draco stuttered out, I don't like Harry." At Lelouch's disbelieving look, he said more desperately, "I don't like him, I swear." Lelouch yawned, pretending to be uninterested in Draco's denial. That just made him even more embarrassed. Looking around to make sure no one was listening, Draco spoke in a hiss. "Don't tell a word of this to anyone or I will never speak to you again." Lelouch smiled and shook hands with Draco. "It's a deal." Dumbledore's office. Rollo shifted, looking around the room warily. Beside him Luciano did the same, but instead of looking at the strange artifacts and occasional moving animal, he was looking for escape routes, ways to quickly use the small room to his advantage, and ways to protect Rollo at the same time. Walking around slightly, he smiled, which was rare to see the bloodthirsty man do, at Rollo, who was unconsciously following him while still looking around in wonder, making sure to stay near his knight and lover. Luciano searched the whole room, coming up with several options before retreating back to the couch they were to stay at until the headmaster arrived. Luciano sat down and pulled a jumpy Rollo into his lap. Rollo squirmed for a minute. "Let go, I want to make a good impression." Luciano just smirked and held him tighter. Rollo squirmed for another minute before finally relenting, knowing that if he truly wanted to he could have gotten out of his lap using his GEASS. Suddenly the door opened and an old, gray-haired man entered the room. He looked at the pair in surprise before quickly putting on a forced smile. "Hello, I'm Professor Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts." Rollo stood and stepped over so Luciano could as well almost naturally. "I'm Rollo Lamperouge, and this is the Knight of 10 and my personal knight, Luciano Bradley," Rollo said smoothly, not showing an ounce of his embarrassment at being caught on Luciano's lap. Dumbledore nodded in greeting at Luciano, who nodded back. "Why, might I ask, have you just now arrived? Surely you could have come earlier with the rest of the Britannians?" Dumbledore asked, prying for more information about the unfamiliar brunette. Rollo gave him a cold look, an almost impossible thing with his childlike face, but he still managed to make it as menacing as Luciano without coffee in the morning. Dumbledore took a quick step back before collecting himself. "That doesn't matter anymore anyway. What matters is that you are here now, my dear boy." Dumbledore turned around to his desk. "Now let's talk classes." Back in the Gryffindor common room, Lelouch stood out of the comfy red chair. He felt he had been sitting in too long. His breath hitched as he felt a pain in his back and immediately stretched to get the painful kink out of his back. Sighing happily as he succeeded, he was surprised when he heard two people laughing behind him. Turning, he saw his knights laughing. Curious, he stepped toward them to see what they were laughing at, causing them to laugh even harder. Gino and Suzaku walked forward to the confused Lelouch. Gino was the one to clear up what they were laughing about. "When you got up and stretched, I commented you sort of looked like a cat stretching, which caused him." He glomped Suzaku's shoulder as he continued to scrunch his face in distaste because of every cat's extreme hatred for him. "Then when you were wondering what we were laughing about, you tilted your head sideways like a cat," he said and chuckled. Lelouch rolled his eyes affectionately at the pair before speaking. "How about we go to the Slytherin common room for a while?" The pair was silent for a minute before Lelouch continued. "I've been sitting here for too long and I need to stretch my legs. I also need to get ready for dinner," Lelouch explained. Suzaku nodded while Gino shrugged his shoulders in a yes. The trio looked around for a moment before spotting Draco. Feeling eyes on him, Draco turned to see Lelouch, Suzaku, and Lelouch looking at him. He walked over to the trio and Gino started talking. "Hey Draco, we were just heading down to the Slytherin common room. You want to go with us?" Draco glanced at the boys' dormitory, torn before going to his sanctuary and leaving Harry. Lelouch noticed and smirked before covering it with a smile. "Suzaku will go get Harry and we'll all go together." Suzaku nodded and headed up the stairs. Lelouch, Gino, and Draco made small talk, and after about 2 minutes Suzaku and Harry's curly heads appeared as they walked out of the boys' dormitory together, laughing as they went. They walked up to the trio and stood for a moment, looking around. "Is everyone ready?" Lelouch asked. Everyone nodded, so Lelouch continued. "Let's head out then." Everyone followed Lelouch as he led the way down to their destination. Once they arrived at the blank slab of wall, Lelouch told the wall the password, revealing its entryway. Harry muttered something about lucky snakes and their lack of shrieking fat ladies, much to Draco's amusement. Once inside, the two Britannian Gryffindors looked around, but to everyone's surprise Harry looked as though he had been there before. Draco looked at Harry suspiciously before asking, "Why do you look like you've been here before, Harry?" Harry blushed at being caught and quickly explained his previous trip there in his second year. He blushed even harder when he mentioned he thought that Draco had been the heir of Slytherin, which caused Draco to laugh. Finally, after Harry finished, the trio of Gryffindors began to notice the lack of Slytherin hostility. Lelouch noticed this and answered their unasked question. When you're friends with Draco Malfoy, everyone has learned not to ask questions. They respect him even more than the seventh years, said seventh years included. Everyone ahead in realization, and they headed over to a recently evacuated green leather sofa. Harry, Suzaku, and Gino sat down on the couch, while Draco and Lelouch sat on the glass table only a step away from the couch. They then started to talk, and before they knew it, dinner was going to be served. Draco and Lelouch went to get washed up for dinner, while Harry, Gino, and Suzaku stayed on the couch to talk about the pair and their royal/pure blood behaviors, and their laugh echoed across the room. After Draco and Lelouch came back, they all exited the Slytherin common room. Once in the Great Hall, they heard some people muttering about a sorting that would happen today. Lelouch smiled a small smile at the thought of his younger brother figure, causing both Gino and Suzaku to smile, because when they saw Lelouch smiling it was hard for them not to. Once in the Great Hall, they decided to sit in their respective tables today for the sorting. If Rollo was to be put in Slytherin/Gryffindor, they would want support at the table for him. So Lelouch and Draco walked the shorter distance to their table, while Suzaku, Gino, and Harry walked to the farthest table in the room. Lelouch was actually feeling good enough to eat, as he was excited about Rollo coming. Draco noticed his appetite and smiled. He would need to tell Suzaku and Gino that he was finally eating a decent amount of food again. Ever since the two of them came to him, worried about Lelouch's well-being and lack of appetite, Draco had been keeping a closer eye on his friend. After everyone was done eating, the tables cleared and the headmaster stepped up to the podium. After clearing his throat and causing everyone to go silent, he smiled out at the students. We are happy to introduce to you 2 more students from Britannia to be taking classes. Professor, if you'll bring the hat. Professor Dumbledore told the tightly pinched lady. She placed the stool and hat down and pulled out a piece of paper. On it read 2 names. Bradley, Luciano. She said monotonously. Everyone except a few jumped when suddenly a smirking Luciano walked through the side door of the Great Hall, of which he slammed. Which was what caused everyone to jump. Lelouch smirked, already knowing the house the scheming man would be placed into, and asked the boy next to him to kindly move down a little for his friend. Meanwhile, Luciano was nearing the stool with the hat. As soon as he stepped on stage, directly in front of it, the hat shouted, causing everyone to jump once again. Slytherin. This caused the pinched professor to look at the boy in horror as he turned and walked to the Slytherin table. Spotting Lelouch, he walked up to him, and they merely looked at each other for a moment before Lelouch stood. It's good to see you, Luciano, Lelouch said warmly, holding out his hand for Luciano to shake. Luciano shook and smirked at the smaller boy. I guess it's nice to see you again, too, he said, though he didn't make it sound as believable as Lelouch had. He sat down next to the brunette, and everyone turned back to the sorting hat. Lamperouge, Rollo. At this, everyone began to mutter as they made the connection between Lelouch and Rollo's last name. Little did they know they were only aliases to help them along in their plan. Everyone's guesses at them being brothers were confirmed when Rollo stepped quietly out of the same room Luciano had. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes searched the crowd for his big brother. Rollo kept walking until he got to the stool and sat down. The hat was lowered onto his head, and after only a minute of silence the hat yelled, Slytherin. Everyone again muttered in confusion at the innocent-looking boy going into Slytherin, but all were silent when Lelouch stood. Rollo saw this and yelled, Big brother. This caused several females to awe at his cuteness. Running up to Lelouch, he wrapped his arms around his waist in a brotherly embrace. It's good to see you, Rollo, Lelouch said, a rare smile for the public eye to see on his face. You too, big brother. /N 10 review. I love it. Next is Chapter 10. I have a surprise in store for it. Be excited. Review my kitties. Yon first day of school again tomorrow, and I was up halfway through the night. Come on, Sevi, let's go to bed. Leads Severus upstairs to her room. Lelouch waved goodbye to Rollo. They had just finished dinner at the Great Hall, and now the 5th years had a free time block, then more free time until lights out. Lelouch scanned the crowded area, looking for his 2 best friends, knowing they couldn't be too far. They had just been beside him a few minutes ago. Finally, Lelouch spotted Gino's bright blonde hair and Suzaku's dark brown curls near the exit of the school. Carefully meandering through the mass of students eager for free time, and he eventually stood successfully beside him. Gino opened the door, gesturing for the two to exit overdramatically. Lelouch and Suzaku chuckled at this, and Lelouch followed Gino outside. For the past 2 weeks, Lelouch and Rollo had been inseparable. Although Lelouch wasn't fond of Luciano, he insisted that even though they didn't like each other, he still needed to be around to protect his baby brother. Lelouch was slightly unsure of Luciano's motives. After he was pretty sure he saw the vampire slap Rollo in the butt, resulting in said younger boy to blush, Lelouch convinced himself he was imagining things, and proceeded to focus on other things when around Rollo. He followed Suzaku and Gino out to the lake and to the closet tree to the lake. November was chilly, and Lelouch was glad for his extremely warm robes for once. Gino quickly muttered a mild warming charm over them, and they sat down on the grass. Lelouch leaning on the trunk, Gino lying on his back in the grass, and Suzaku lounging on his side, absent-mindedly picking grass. They sat quiet for a moment before Lelouch broke the comfortable silence. "Is Luciano sexually assaulting my brother?" he asked. Gino quickly sat up coughing, while Suzaku too sat up before sitting cross-legged, not looking Lelouch in the eye. "Well, you see," Gino started, but couldn't get the courage to tell Lelouch, for fear of his anger. He turned to Suzaku, pleading for his to continue. When Lelouch noticed Suzaku's hesitation, he quickly scooted closer to the two and away from the tree. "What is it?" he asked, angry at them for keeping something from him. When he noticed their fearful expressions, he quickly attempted to quell his anger. The last thing he wanted was to scare his two best friends away from him. After he calmed down, he looked at them with pleading eyes, begging them to tell him. "I promise I won't be mad." "You," he mentally added. Suzaku quickly realized that Gino wouldn't speak, so sighing he began to talk, slowly as though he were stepping around broken glass. "Well, Luciano and Rollo, well, they're—" Suzaku looked between Gino and Lelouch before swallowing. "Well, they're together." Both Gino and Suzaku automatically leaned back slightly, even though they knew it wouldn't help them avoid the wrath in any way. Both boys winced as Lelouch spoke, but he surprised them when he talked in an eerily calm voice. "What do you mean, together?" Gino spoke up first. "Together as in dating, I guess." Suzaku piped up, "I think they're lovers." Lelouch was silent for a moment. Why would he like Luciano? How can he like such a scumbag? Lelouch asked, disgust showing on his face. Suzaku's eyes flashed to Lelouch's in surprise. "Is that what is bothering you? Is that it's Luciano, not that he's a guy? Or his knight?" Gino added hesitantly. Lelouch suspiciously looked between the two, trying to piece everything together. Does it bother him that he is dating a guy, his own knight? The way they always seem to pay more attention to him than normal knights. Suddenly he didn't think any of them were talking about Luciano and Rollo, including himself. Lelouch felt like smacking himself in the face. He had been so dense. He hadn't noticed what was right in front of him. How he, a genius, hadn't figured it out surprised him greatly. Suzaku and Gino couldn't even tell Lelouch was having a mental conversation with himself. Suddenly his face twisted into a smirk, one that made Suzaku and Gino almost blush at. For it wasn't his usual smirk. It was a whole different type. "Well, I'd be a hypocrite if I said that," he said, hinting to see if he was correct. When both their eyes widened, he knew he was correct. Leaning forward, he crawled over to Suzaku on his hands and knees. Putting his hands on Suzaku's shoulders, he gracefully slid into Suzaku's lap, legs on either side of his waist. His eyes locked with Suzaku, and he leaned forward to brush his lips lightly against Suzaku, not quite making complete contact. Reaching his arm around Suzaku, Lelouch grabbed onto Gino's arm and pulled him to him as well. Gino sat behind Suzaku, and Lelouch pulled on his collar, making his head hover just over Suzaku's shoulder. Lelouch sat up slightly and pressed his mouth securely to Gino's in a full-out kiss. Suzaku's arms snaked around Lelouch's waist, and he started to kiss his emperor's neck. Gino hesitantly started to kiss back, and when he realized that the younger boy wouldn't run away, he probed Lelouch's mouth with his tongue. Lelouch immediately opened his mouth and Gino's tongue was in his mouth before he could blink. Suzaku kept patiently kissing Lelouch on the neck, moving up to his jaw and down to his collarbone lightly, causing his victim to shudder in his lap. After the need for air became greater than their need, Lelouch leaned back, needing air much more than Gino. Breathing hard, he put a quick but tender kiss on Gino's lips before turning back to Suzaku, who had stopped his ministrations when Lelouch and Gino had. Suzaku leaned forwards and captured Lelouch's mouth in a slow kiss before quickly speeding up. Lelouch tried to get his tongue in Suzaku's mouth first, but Suzaku quickly won dominance over the lithe boy. Suzaku pressed closer to Lelouch, neck stretched downwards to accommodate the smaller boy. Gino immediately took advantage of the revealed skin, latching his lips onto the delicate skin of Suzaku's neck. Gino wrapped his arms around Suzaku's waist and continued kissing down his neck. Pulling his robe slightly down on his shoulder, Gino quickly nipped at Suzaku's shoulder, marking him where no one else could see, knowing Suzaku would be mad if he ever marked any higher. He hadn't enjoyed his punishment last time. Suzaku moaned lowly at the bite and pulled back from Lelouch, who had smirked into the kiss at Suzaku's moan. The three were breathing heavily and Gino quickly looked around to see if anyone had been watching them the last couple of minutes. Luck was on their side and he noticed they were the only three outside. Gino stood and helped Lelouch off of Suzaku. Suzaku stood not soon after and Gino wrapped an arm around each boy. "Why don't we head back inside?" Gino asked and the other two nodded. The three walked leisurely back into the castle, coming to a stop outside the doors. Gino noticed Lelouch's hesitation at going in the Great Hall and quickly pulled his arm back. "If you don't want to go it like that, it's okay," he said, smiling sincerely at Lelouch. Even though Lelouch knew that they would both keep it a secret if Lelouch wanted, he still saw the pain and slightly rejection in their eyes. "No, I think it's fine. If anyone has anything to say, they can say it to me," Lelouch said before grabbing Gino and Suzaku's hands with each of his. Suzaku nodded, smiling at the younger, and Gino pulled Lelouch into a quick hug. "Thanks," he said, every ounce of his feelings for Lelouch and Suzaku seeping through the one word. Lelouch nodded and locked eyes with a smiling Suzaku. Gino backed up and grabbed Lelouch's hand again, before nodding to Lelouch. Lelouch nodded back and Gino and Suzaku opened the door. Squeezing Gino and Suzaku's hand in comfort, Lelouch led the way with hardened eyes, determined to make the castle a safe place for the three of them together. The three walked in and Gino immediately began to lead the way through the mass of students. It was easier for him to lead when he was taller than everyone and could see the perfect way to go. Spotting Harry and Draco sitting on the couch up the first flight of stairs in the entrance hall, the three made their way over to them. Once out of the mass, Suzaku began to lead them up the stairs. Once at the top, they found the mildly surprised Draco and Harry, looking at their intertwined fingers. They didn't have to ask what was going on between the three of them, having been around them long enough to know of the feelings the three boys had for each other. Not to mention Harry had overheard Suzaku and Gino's plans of wooing Lelouch a long time beforehand. Harry stood and sat next to Draco, leaving 2 seats left. Lelouch went to open his mouth to say they'd go somewhere else for lack of room, when Suzaku sat down. Gino sat down next to Suzaku, leaving no place for Lelouch. Lelouch let a rare pout spread across his face as he glared away from the pair. He let out a surprised yelp when he was pulled onto Gino's lap, facing Suzaku, Harry, and Draco. Instead of getting embarrassed, Lelouch just harumphed and shifted slightly until he was comfortable and let out a contented sigh. The 5 students sat for a while with Gino, Harry, and Suzaku talking about Quidditch. Gino and Suzaku had decided to try out for Quidditch due to Harry and Lelouch's constant badgering of them wanting them to. They both beat out several flyers that had been training for years for the positions of chasers and soon had official places on the team. Gino and Suzaku were chasers with one other Gryffindor boy by the name of Greg McHenry. Their keeper was a troublemaker who, when suspended from games, would be temporarily replaced by Suzaku. Even though Suzaku was better than Greg at being keeper, he was even better at being a chaser. Draco had quickly learned that the Gryffindor team would be unstoppable against anyone with Harry, Suzaku, and Gino had quit the Slytherin team, not having any intention of playing a losing season. He was a Slytherin through and through after all, and that's what any real Slytherins would do and did. Many of the good Slytherin players also quit after Draco told them the odds of them winning. This allowed for the inexperienced and horrid younger Slytherins a chance to play. Gryffindor was 4-0 with only one more game until winter break, which would start 2 weeks before Christmas and would start back in the middle of January. Lelouch, on the other hand, hadn't even bothered to try out for the Slytherin team, knowing even with all the good Slytherins not trying out he still wouldn't have a chance with his bad stamina. He hadn't even attempted to get on a broom since his last fall, and he wasn't sure he ever would. Soon Rollo and Luciano were spotted in the mass of students, who were still staring at the trio, shocked at not only their open homosexualness, but with there being 3 of them. They saw the 3 of them, and Luciano was the first to notice the position that Lelouch was in and what it meant. He walked up, slouching with his hands in his pockets to the group, Rollo running in front of him. When he was in front of them, he said approvingly to Suzaku and Gino, "You sly dogs." Gino grinned at him while Suzaku glared and Lelouch blushed, looking away. "I'm happy for you, big brother," Rollo said, and as soon as Lelouch stood he hugged his waist happily. Then Lelouch remembered what had even gotten their conversation started outside. His eyes turned from soft to hard in a second, and he lightly pushed Rollo behind him. Glaring at Luciano, he said in a deadly voice, "What do you think you've been doing with Rollo?" Luciano held his hands up as though innocent and said in a sickly sweet voice, "I don't know what you've been talking about." Lelouch stepped closer to the red-haired man in his anger. "Why do you think you can have someone as sweet as Rollo when you've got blood all over your hands?" Luciano looked at Lelouch in surprise. Rollo spoke up from behind Lelouch. "Big brother, I can explain." He was cut off as Lelouch rounded on him. "You're in no place to make that statement, young man. You're in just as much trouble as he is," Lelouch said before turning back to Luciano. "Why do you think I would let you be with him after everything you've done?" Lelouch asked, even angrier. He was surprised when Rollo appeared beside Luciano, having used his GEASS. Luciano crouched down so Rollo could envelope him in a hug, knowing how bad it hurt his lover when his brother didn't accept him with the love of his life. Rollo stepped back from Luciano as soon as he hugged him and turned around to face Lelouch, just as angry as Lelouch had been. "How dare you?" he said before debating to say something. Finally his anger got the best of him and he said what he knew he would regret. "You're not exactly innocent and deserving either." Rollo's eyes widened as he saw the pain in Lelouch's eyes and turned and ran to the Slytherin dungeons, unable to see the pain he caused his older brother. Lelouch stood still, emotions crossing his face. Anger, pain, confusion. They flashed back and forth, faster and faster, until they were too unbearable for anyone to watch. Suzaku and Gino had already been standing, too shocked to move, before seeing Lelouch's shoulders begin to shake. Thinking their love was crying, they moved forward to comfort him when suddenly Lelouch spun around. There were no tears down his face, and he wasn't crying. His eyes showed no emotions as he laughed a deep laugh that soon bordered on hysterical. As sudden as the laughter had started, it stopped. "Lelouch," both Gino and Suzaku said at the same time. They both stepped forward again, but Lelouch raised his hand, telling them to stop. "The truth, even though it hurts, it's still the truth." With that, Lelouch turned and ran down the stairs and through the hall. Neither Gino nor Suzaku had made a move to follow, only because they were too shocked to move and speak yet again. To the side, Draco and Harry stood just as shocked. Harry's hand had come up to cover his mouth in shock even before Rollo had spoke, and Draco's eyes had widened. His knuckles had whitened as he clenched his hand in a fist. This changed everything they knew about the Britannians or had thought they knew. Even still, they knew it was not the time to ask questions. They needed to help their friends recover and hopefully get back together. Then have the greatest comeback the school had ever saw. /N. Yeah, I know. It was like the golden tomato was there then. Flash, it's gone. Reviews, on the other hand, will make it come back. 6 reviews. That's okay, I guess. Better than 3. To think I had 8 and then 10 the last 2 times. Maybe with school starting again, people have less time to review, but still have time to read. Strange. I stayed home for half the day 'cause I'm sick. But if I don't go in at least half the day, and if I don't go to practice, I can't start the basketball game tomorrow. Glomp Sev. Sorry for not including you much lately, Sev. I'll include you next chapter. Suzaku kept glancing towards the door of the potions classroom. Gino was beside him, tapping his foot and worrying his bottom lip between his teeth. Draco and Harry looked at the pair, half in sympathy for their worried friends, half in annoyance at their constant tapping and rustling. Nobody in the room was faring any better, and eventually Snape glided up to the boys. 20 points from Gryffindor for your insufferable noises and distractions from the class. Now where is Mr. Lamperouche? Gino and Suzaku looked away from each other and didn't answer. In the back of the room, Rollo sat next to Luciano. They had been transferred to the same classes as his brother the day after they had arrived. Luciano looked at Rollo out of the corner of his eye, knowing the guilt that would be crossed against his young lover's face. Rollo didn't disappoint, looking as though he would cry any minute. He knew it would hurt his brother, he had wanted it to. He was threatening his happiness with the love of his life. How could he have not wanted it to hurt? He wouldn't have said it if he had knew it would be this bad. Lelouch had immediately shut himself into his and Draco's shared room. Only Draco had been allowed to come in, and what he saw almost made him want to cry. Lelouch had curled up into a ball on his bed, clearly not having thought Draco would have come in. He had his arms wrapped around his puppy, and tear streaks were still clear on his cheeks. Draco stood shocked for several minutes. Lelouch was one of the strongest people he knew, and to see him break down like that was like pulling the only rug in the world out from under his feet, leaving him to spiral into darkness. Draco moved over to him, and the puppy wriggled in his arms, wanting to be put down. Blearily, Lelouch woke up and revealed his unnaturally clouded purple eyes. Draco hated to see him like this. Come on, Lelouch, you need to change. Draco changed and then waited for Lelouch to as well. Lelouch ignored him and just sat there. Finally, Draco got tired of his unresponsiveness. Draco quickly stripped him down to his boxers. He grabbed Lelouch's pajamas and slipped Lelouch into them. He buttoned up the shirt and moved to leave. Lelouch's hand grasped Draco's sleeve. His eyes narrowed and he looked away as though ashamed. Stay with me? He said. Draco looked at him as though he was crazy. Don't want to be alone. Lelouch mumbled. Hate my nightmares. Draco immediately crawled into the bed beside the depressed teen. He himself had suffered nightmares ever since he came to Hogwarts, and he knew Lelouch just needed the comfort. It wasn't as though they were going to do anything inappropriate anyway. Draco laid on his back and Lelouch laid on his stomach beside him. Tired, he looped his arm around Draco's neck and placed his face in the crook of Draco's neck. His nose brushed against his soft blonde hair. Draco comfortingly wound his arm around Lelouch's waist, drawing him closer to him. Draco himself knew that this wouldn't change anything between the two. Everybody was allowed a moment of weakness, and it just so happened Draco showed his too. Lelouch almost immediately fell asleep. Draco lay there longer, contemplating on just how to get the very deserving brunette in his arms to his very distressed lovers safely. Draco had relayed most of what happened, leaving out the fact that he slept in the same bed as Lelouch, to Gino and Suzaku at breakfast the next morning. He then later related to Rollo, who burst into tears. Luciano went to comfort him, and Harry was filled in as well. Rollo felt like he had cried all he could, but tears still welled up in the corners of his eyes. Snape's eyes were diverted, and Luciano quickly pecked Rollo underneath the eye. Rollo looked up at his gratefully before turning back to listen to the rest of the conversation between their head of house and the two Britannian Gryffindors. Lelouch wasn't feeling well, or so we heard. Gino finally mumbled. Suzaku nodded his agreement sadly. Snape turned around to the board and quickly wrote out the instructions to the potion. Read my lips. Follow the directions on the board. I need to speak to Draco outside, and if I hear any of you misbehaving, you'll be living in hell for the next 2 months. With that and a swirl of his black robes, Snape was gone. Draco followed quickly, knowing how impatient his godfather was by the tone of his voice. What is it, Sev? Draco asked, curious as to why he had been called out. This thing's about Lelouch. Should I be worried or anything? Severus asked, his cold demeanor shattered when it was just him and his godson. Lelouch was one of his favorite students, and was in his own house. Plus, the Dark Lord wanted a meeting between the Britannians and himself soon. It should blow over. Rollo said some extremely depressing stuff to Lelouch about not being deserving enough for Gino and Suzaku right after they had gotten together. It really got him down, and I feel really bad for him. Rollo hadn't meant to say something hurtful, but he was protecting his and Luciano's relationship, which apparently Lelouch didn't approve of. Draco finished, breathing heavily after saying it all in one go. Severus' eyebrows rose before he rolled his eyes. I haven't been worried in God knows how long, and it's over some drama. Huffing, he turned while muttering drama, as though it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Draco couldn't help but laugh, before they somberly headed back into the classroom. HP_time skip _CGCGCGCG. Suzaku and Gino paced around the Slytherin common room. It was already past dinner and Lelouch had yet to step outside of the room. Suzaku sprinted over to the door for what felt like the millionth time and banged hard on the door. Lelouch, you need to let us in. What Rollo said was true and we all know it. Even Rollo knows it. Said boy was once again crying, sitting in the vampire of Britannia's lap. I take back what I said. I was mad and said the first things that came to mind. Rollo sobbed again, grateful that the common room had been cleared of everyone else via Draco's orders. Rollo hated showing this weakness, but Lelouch was his brother now, and seeing Slash hear him like this was downright depressing. Finally Suzaku got frustrated and fell to the ground in a heap. Gino noticed this and his determination doubled. Backing up from the door, Gino lifted one foot and balanced carefully before slamming his foot as hard as he could. It broke in half due to the force, only to be pushed aside by Gino and Suzaku as they sprinted into the room. Lelouch had sat up in his bed at the loud noise. His eyes widened at the sight of two blurs by the names of Gino and Suzaku running at him. Suddenly he was enveloped by two pairs of strong arms. Gino sat cross-legged and pulled Suzaku onto his lap sideways with Lelouch on the other side. They sat there for what seemed like hours. Rollo ran into the room after the room. He saw Lelouch and immediately spoke, rushing to get his apology out. I'm so sorry, Lelouch. I had just been so mad. I spoke wrongly. He almost continued when he saw Lelouch's purple eyes blink at him from the mass of arms and legs. He nodded to Rollo and immediately Rollo knew he was forgiven. Luciano tugged his small love out of the room, giving the three some much-needed alone time. The three sat in silence, comfortable just being together. They were all drained emotionally and Gino noticed Lelouch's eyes start to droop. Carefully lifting the two off of him, Gino stood and took off his shirt and pants, leaving him in his red and blue boxers. Lelouch's eyes had widened before he realized he was just getting ready for bed. Suzaku followed suit with Lelouch more hesitant. Lelouch had changed out of his pajamas about halfway through the day, determined to get out, then never did. Finally they were all in only boxers and Gino and Lelouch followed Suzaku under the blankets. The three cuddled close together, content to be together. Draco peeked his head in the room a couple minutes later. Smirking, Draco ducked out of the room. Hey Harry, will it be okay for me to sleep in one of their beds tonight? I think they need their space, Draco said suggestively, causing Harry to laugh and nod. Mission accomplished, Draco thought smugly. /N 9 reviews. Gah, you guys make me happy. This chapter wasn't written very well. The beginning was kind of random with flashback now, and I apologize, but I didn't know how to change it without scrapping the idea all over. Severus. Monotonous voice. Review for our dear authoress here. She works her butt off for you. Receives glomp from author with a roll of his eyes. Happy now? Yeah. Thanks, Sev. It had been 2 days since all of the drama between Rollo and Lelouch had ended. Rollo had his chance to apologize to Lelouch personally, which Lelouch accepted with a brief, I was being childish. It wasn't your fault, Rollo. Even though Lelouch was trying not to make a big deal about it, Rollo knew he was forgiven. Lelouch didn't say anything about not wanted Rollo and Luciano together, to the relief of his little brother and his lover. Lelouch had gone back to class after the day of not going to any. He was practiced at ignoring their scolding of skipping classes, having heard it all before at his old school. Instead of giving detentions, they deducted house points. Everything had been smooth sailing for the past few days, and Lelouch knew it was time to put their plan in action. Okay, after dinner I have arranged a meeting with Severus Snape in his office with us after this. We need to put our plan into action. Lelouch said in low voices to Gino, Suzaku, Rollo, and Luciano. He had talked to the potions master earlier that day, and they were to meet the Dark Lord tonight. Lelouch couldn't say anything more as Draco and Harry tuned into their conversation. What are you guys whispering about? Draco asked suspiciously. They looked between each other, not answering. If it's about your meeting with Severus, I already know about it, Draco said, purposefully shifting his arm to show the Britannians his dark mark. Harry and I are scheduled to go as well, he said to the surprise of the rest. Lelouch nodded and turned back to the other Britannians. You are to wear your Zero Nightmare pilot garbs under your new Knight of the Rounds garbs, he said. The rest nodded at his orders. Draco and Harry just looked at Lelouch oddly for commanding them to do whatever he wanted. Lelouch decided that they were valuable allies, and in 1 second decided to let them know the full story. If you guys will meet us before we go to Snape's office. We have some things we need to talk about before we go to him, Lelouch said, and Suzaku and Gino looked at him wide-eyed. Lelouch looked at them warningly and they complied, eating in silence. If you don't mind, we are going ahead on, Lelouch said. Draco and Harry nodded as Lelouch, Gino, Suzaku, Luciano, and Rollo stood. They walked out of the Great Hall, Dumbledore and a few other teachers looking at them suspiciously. They headed up to the Gryffindor common room where Suzaku and Gino packed their uniforms into bags to change into once in the Slytherin common room. They didn't want to raise any more suspicion by parading around in them until time to meet the Dark Lord. They headed back to the Slytherin common room silently, no one having spoken since they had left the Great Hall. Luciano and Rollo went to their room while Gino and Suzaku followed them to Lelouch's. They were pleasantly surprised that Draco and Harry hadn't made it back to Draco's room yet, and Suzaku and Gino used the opportunity to make sure their emperor was sure. Are you sure this is the right thing to do, Lelouch? Suzaku asked as Gino sat down on the bed. Lelouch turned and smiled reassuringly at Suzaku before leaning over to seal it with a kiss. He pulled back and turned to his closet. I'm sure, Suzaku, Lelouch said. He slyly smirked at Suzaku over his should as he raised his shirt up slightly, teasing him as he undressed. He jumped when he felt warm hands around his waist. He turned as Gino buried his head in Lelouch's shoulder. Do you expect me to control myself? Gino asked as his voice slightly husky as it blew against the sensitive skin on Lelouch's neck. Yes, Lelouch said teasingly to his boyfriend, and to his surprise yelped as he was lifted off the ground. He was dumped onto the bed and closed his eyes as he expected Gino to pounce on his. After a minute he slowly opened his eyes to see what was taking them so long. His eyes widened as he saw Gino had Suzaku pinned the wall, his tongue practically raping Suzaku's mouth. By the moan that was coming out of Suzaku's mouth though, he didn't seem to mind too much. Lelouch said there, too enthralled in what the other boys were doing to make any move to join them. He felt himself growing hard in his pants, and he couldn't help the moan that mimicked Suzaku's as Gino growled possessively. Suzaku's head snapped away from Gino's as he looked at Lelouch in shock and amusement. Gino's lips simply moved to Suzaku's neck, and Suzaku once again moaned this one needier than the last. Lelouch was just about to join them when the door swung open. So are you guys? Rollo stopped and choked as he saw what the two boys were doing. Luciano just moved in beside him, seemingly unfazed. Why didn't you cover my eyes to keep my soul nice and innocent like a good boyfriend? Rollo pouted teasingly. Luciano barked out laughter before baring his teeth teasingly to his lover. Hell, you and I have done more than that, he said, loud enough for Lelouch to hear. Lelouch erupted into a coughing fit, extremely unhappy to hear on how far his younger brother had gone with his much older boyfriend. Rollo glared at Luciano lightly before moving to comfort his brother. Lelouch waved him off. We need to go ahead and get changed anyway. I do like the new versions we got for you guys. It will look smashing with my Zero outfit, he said, as though fashion was one of the most important things at the moment. Suzaku and Gino rolled their eyes lovingly at their best friend/lover/emperor's antics. Rollo and Luciano left the room while Lelouch, Suzaku, and Gino changed into their desired outfits. Suzaku, Gino, and Luciano's outfit were very much the same. It was exact replicas of their Knights of the Round uniforms, except everywhere they had been white they were black. The gold outlines and stripes were even brighter gold, standing out on the black material. The capes were black in the white spots as well. The blue, green, and orange on the capes respectively were the only difference of the three knights, and they stood out brightly. The only change to the actual design was the deep hood purposefully put there to cover the wearer's identity. Lelouch was to wear his Zero costume. The only difference was everything was outlined in gold to match his knight's outfits. Rollo too was wearing a Knight of the Round outfit that matched Gino, Suzaku, and Luciano's. His cape was a blood-red color, marking it different from all the other Knights of the Round's cape. They were finished and they all piled onto Lelouch's large bed. Luciano sat against the headboard while Rollo curled up to his side, his long fingers in the slightly curly brown hair. Gino was lying on his stomach at the bottom of the bed. Suzaku was laying against him with his chin on his chest while Lelouch was curled up to Suzaku. They were content to sit there until the Slytherin Ice Prince and boy who lived arrived. HPHPHPHPHPDMDMDMDMDM equals 3. Draco and Harry sat in the Great Hall for a few minutes before decided to go wander the halls to give the Britannians time to get ready. Draco led the way up the staircase and eventually they reached the room of requirement. He let Harry choose how the room would look and followed him in. He was pleased to see a warm room with a single fireplace, with no red or green in sight. Harry must have purposefully done that, symbolizing that their houses didn't matter while they were in the room together. Draco blushed as he thought of what that meant, but pulled himself together before turning back to Harry. Harry blushed at the intense gaze that Draco gave him. Harry gulped as he thought of what Gino and Suzaku had suggested he do. He told them he really liked Draco, and he wanted to let him know he wanted to be more than friends. At the same time, he wanted to give Draco a way out in case he wasn't comfortable with it. He blushed deeper as he remembered exactly how they thought he should tell him. How could they expect that Harry would just outright kiss Draco? Could they not tell Harry was obviously shy about affections and stuff of the like? They should at least be able to tell that he was afraid of being rejected. That was probably why they reassured him that they knew Draco would respond positively. He was told that Draco had similar conversations with Lelouch, but for some reason he could never see Draco and Lelouch acting like a bunch of girls and discussing how to show someone they liked them. He was startled out of his slightly humorous, yet nerve-wracking thoughts by Draco's hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Draco asked, obviously concerned. Harry hadn't noticed that they had sat down, and he blushed as he realized how close Draco's face had come to his own. Harry's mind immediately went blank as he did the one thing he had swore he wouldn't do, closing his eyes to relish in the taste of one Draco Malfoy. Draco's lips were frozen on his own as his eyes widened. Harry was about to pull back, embarrassed by the lack of response when Draco suddenly kissed back. Harry kissed back just as fervently, gasping when Draco bit on his upper lip, effectively opening his mouth to Draco's invading tongue. The battle for dominance was not lost on either of them, but Draco quickly sucked hard on Harry's tongue, winning the battle as a low moan came from Draco. If Harry had been in his right state of mind, he would have been extremely embarrassed at the noises he was making. Draco had pushed Harry onto his back on the sofa while placing soft kisses on his neck. He suddenly bit down, leaving his mark. Harry moaned, partly in pain but mostly in pleasure as Draco continued on his neck. Draco hesitantly put his hand under Harry's shirt, not at all shocked when Harry jumped and immediately started to push Draco away. "Don't you think he was going to continue?" but was cut off as Draco lifted him onto his lap. "Too fast?" Draco asked with a smile. Harry nodded, suddenly shy. "It's fine. I don't mind going slow for you. It's the least I can do," Draco said before leaning in to give Harry a delicate kiss. He pulled back and put his head onto Harry's. "Is this okay?" he asked as he snaked his arms more comfortably around his Gryffindor's hips. He purred as he mentally thought that again. His Gryffindor's hips. He liked the sound of that. "How about we go and see what they have to say, boyfriend?" Draco asked while pulling Harry off of him and standing together. Harry nodded happily, having heard only the last word his boyfriend spoke. MMH, boyfriend, he liked the sound of that, the /n. Thanks to the following people for reviewing. Rain, Draco Shikachar Jutsud HW. Munyazu 9, Fady, one of the colorless, Phobias Athena, Lelouch Fangirl, and Heidi Fox. Important. Does anyone have any qualms about me writing M-rated stuff? Let me know so I won't scare you off. Should I go ahead and change the rating? Let me know these things. I wonder if I can get more than 12 reviews this time. I'll still update even if I don't. But it would be a great present along with making me want to update sooner than usual. Plus it's chapter 12. Review for a Canon and Schneasel plushie bundle. They squeak. Hugs, the real. Sev and Squeaks said plushies. Multiple times, Sev. Review you daft bimbos. That wasn't nice. Draco and Harry walked leisurely through the hallways. They knew that most students would still be in the Great Hall, and took the pleasure of holding hands all the way to the Slytherin common room. When they reached the wall, they both pulled their hands back with a small smile. They would tell everyone when they were ready. Draco opened the passageway and waited for Harry to walk through before following. Draco then led the way to Lelouch and his room, knocking before pulling open the door. What he saw surprised him, and if he had been a girl he would have been gushing. Lelouch was asleep on top of Gino and Suzaku, while Rollo was curled up like a cat on Luciano's lap. Draco smiled softly at Harry before marching up to the bed. He put his palms face down on the bed and began shaking the bed roughly. Wake up. You wanted to talk to us before we went to meet Sev, right? Lelouch woke up first, rubbing sleepily at his eyes before sitting up completely. He stretched out before bouncing up and down curiously, unable to comprehend what he had been laying on. A groan was his only answer, and he peered down at the groaning Suzaku. Gino laughed lightly at them as he too sat up. Luciano merely sat up straighter, allowing Rollo to sit comfortably in his lap. Draco looked back at Harry, questioning with his eyes. Harry blushed before nodding slightly. He looked away and yelped as he was pulled onto the bed as well. Draco sat Indian style with his arms snaked around Harry's waist. Nobody looked the least bit shocked, and continued to blink sleepily, trying to erase all evidence they had fallen asleep. Harry looked bewildered as Draco got more comfortable. Lelouch stood, knowing he couldn't explain everything to Harry without something he had read about in a book when he had first arrived at the castle. He reached delicately under his bed and grabbed a large bowl, before putting it on the side table. He reached for his wand before closing his eyes and breathing in deeply. He carefully thought of what to include and what not to before raising his wand to his temple. With a muttered incantation, a long white wispy strand of silvery smoke followed his wand as he brought it towards the bowl. He carefully put it into the bowl, and watched for a moment as it swirled around mesmerizingly. He took a deep breath before turning back to the large group. I have put in the memories that I trust you with. You are not allowed to speak to anyone about this, is that understood? Lelouch was fine with Draco and Harry just nodding, knowing he didn't have to make an unbreakable vow. Harry would keep Draco in check well enough. Are all of us watching? Luciano asked as he too stood up. Lelouch nodded, sparing a quick glance at Suzaku. I figure it is best you foresee exactly what I let them know, and if you want to add anything from your history you can afterwards. Gino and Rollo nodded while Suzaku looked conflicted. You don't have to tell them anything you don't want to. I just feel that they need to know what happened to get us here, and they can be valuable allies too. Lelouch reasoned. Suzaku strode quickly forward and pulled Lelouch into a bone-crushing hug. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about you. How can you fare looking back at all those horrible memories? Lelouch set his jaw as hugged Suzaku back, knowing he had to be strong. He pulled away and turned towards the pensive. He gestured for everyone to follow as he lowered his face into the watery substance, effectively going into his own memories, knowing several others would as well. Inside the pensive, Lelouch carefully masked his features as he waited for everyone to arrive. Finally Draco, Harry, Suzaku, Gino, Luciano, and Rollo all arrived, waiting for the memories to start. It will probably make more sense if I narrate it myself. If you have any questions, just ask, and I can sort of pause the memory to answer. Everyone nodded in understand, and Lelouch started the first memory. It was a little Lelouch around the age of 8. He was playing around with a young girl a few years younger than him. The only way you could tell they were related was by their eyes. I'll start at the beginning. Who you see now is me and my younger sister, Nunali. We were very close at that age. This woman here, Lelouch, went and stood next to the mother watching the children. She was my mom. She married Charles Z. Britannia, the Emperor of Britannia, and had both me and Nunali. I was born the 19th heir to the throne of Britannia, the rising nation that was conquering the world one country at a time. Life was fine, and my sister and I were blissfully ignorant of the chaos in our own family. Lelouch paused as the scene changed. Young Lelouch was running fast through the hall, and the large group quickly followed him. He burst through the doors of the throne room before stopping in shock. His eyes widened and he started shaking as he took in the whole scene. His mother was lying dead over his sister in the middle of the stairs. Glass was shattered everywhere, and if it weren't by the twitching of his sister's hands and eyes, he would have thought both of his most loved ones were dead. I was the one who found them. My sister was paralyzed from the waist down and lost her eyesight from trauma. My mother was dead. The scene changed swiftly to Lelouch dressed in his royal robes. He was still young as he marched up to the bottom of the emperor's chair. My father had nothing to do with us after our mother's death. He didn't once visit my sister while she was in critical condition, or even after she healed as much as she could. I was furious, and when I confronted him about it, he sent us away to live with Suzaku, whose father was the Prime Minister of Japan. Lelouch looked Draco straight in the eyes as he spoke again. He told everyone we died. We lived with Suzaku for years, before we met the Ashford family. We started going to Ashford High and things were looking up. We adopted the last name of Lamperouge and all was well. The scene shifted through and Draco watched as Lelouch rode with Rollo, almost colliding with the giant truck. They watched Lelouch hurry into the truck and watched as no one noticed Lelouch fall into the truck as it sped away. Lelouch just let the scenes play through, letting the scenes speak for themselves. Colin spoke loudly about the poison gas before getting into her Glasgow. Harry and Draco watched as the truck came to a stop and Suzaku appeared in the memory. Suzaku dove and covered Lelouch's face with his own mask as the poison gas was released. They were shocked to see a beautiful green-haired girl instead. Suzaku bravely stood up for his friend and the innocent girl, and for that he was shot. They watched amazed as Lelouch used his power of GEASS on the soldiers and how he took Valletta's nightmare frame fairly easily. Suzaku was bandaged up and Draco and Harry watched, fascinated as Lelouch outsmarted the Britannian forces and went straight to the head of the operation. The lights of the camera dimmed and they saw an attractive blonde sitting in a chair, who was obviously the one who called the ceasefire. Lelouch stepped out of the shadows with a gun pointed at his brother. My brother, Clovis, was Viceroy of Japan, now dubbed Area 11. He was one of my favorite half-brothers, always able to lighten the mood. I know I should have killed him, but instead I faked his death and used my GEASS on him to make him live in secret until I spoke to him again. Everyone thought their beloved Viceroy was dead and they held a funeral. I gathered the group I had commanded and made sure to hide my identity from them. They would have been stunned to find a Britannian schoolboy at the head of a massive rebellion. I formed the Black Knights and together we slowly defeated some of the parts of Britannia and made good allies. More flashes of battles went by and Suzaku was taken as Knight of Euphemia Lee Britannia. The scene changed to Lelouch making plans with Euphemia for peace, who was not surprised at the fact that her brother was in fact Zero. Lelouch jokingly told her that if he commanded her to kill all the Japanese, who she loved dearly, she would have no choice but to obey. At that moment, Lelouch's GEASS went out of control and forced her to kill all the Japanese. Lelouch was heartbroken as he fired the shot that killed his half-sister. They watched as Lelouch was captured by Suzaku and Lelouch ordered Suzaku to live, to help them escape. The final showdown between Suzaku and Lelouch shocked everyone the most. They were shocked as Lelouch was captured by Suzaku and brought to his knees in front of his father. Charles used his own GEASS on Lelouch, forcing him to forget ever being Zero or even a part of the Black Knights. They took Noonally away from him and planted a secret agent to Phil as his brother. Lelouch was separated from his brother, and he saw the woman CC again. He didn't remember her but still ran to catch her as she was shot out of the open pit of her nightmare frame. When they touched, she once again gave him his power of GEASS. In doing so, he regained all of his memories. I felt so betrayed. Noonally, the one I treasured most, was replaced by a boy who happened to look like me. His eyes were the same color as my sister and I, and no one noticed anything weird or asked about the disappearance of my sister. I realized then that my father had used his GEASS to make everyone forget everything about knowing Noonally, and anything that made me suspicious was erased as well. I didn't take long for me to regroup with the few soldiers I had remaining, and I quickly confronted Rollo about faking being my brother. The scene changed and Rollo stood, looking at the screens in the control room they used to keep track of Lelouch. Rollo stood stock still as he saw Lelouch standing behind him in one of the screens, a gun pointed and loaded at his head. Rollo was still as Lelouch questioned him. Then, before you could blink, Rollo had the gun and was pointing it at Lelouch. I convinced him I needed him, and I learned his story. He received a GEASS from a different immortal than I. His name was VV, and he gave Rollo the ability to freeze time. That made Rollo the best possible assassin, and he was used in most of Britannian's dirty work. He was given the job to watch me and was given the name Rollo. Lelouch smiled at Rollo as the scene changed. Battle scenes played through, and finally Lelouch was taken to his father's weapon against God. Lelouch quickly shattered part of the weapon and used his GEASS on him, commanding him to die. Lelouch walked, hysterically happy, to his believed to be dead father. He was horrified to find that Charles had killed VV, therefore making him immortal. Lelouch used his GEASS on God to kill his father and actually a live mother, who had been hiding in the body of Anya the whole time. With his parents dead, Lelouch stepped out of the shadows and claimed the throne of Britannian to himself. When people started to outrage, Suzaku appeared and was dubbed the Knight of Zero. Meanwhile, his brother Schneasel was grouping together as many of the anti-Lelouch groups together to rebel against the new Britannia, who was under the control of Lelouch, the boy everyone had though died almost 10 years before. Lelouch teamed up with Gino and Suzaku and carefully infiltrated the carrier Schneasel, and his servant cannon were in. Lelouch used his GEASS to pacify the two and successfully broke the rebellion against the Empire. End pensive memories. Gino started talking to Draco and Harry, who were standing stock still, understanding flashing across their faces. Lelouch was unsure of how to rule his country when half of it was against him, so he decided to take a temporary leave, allowing his right-hand woman Colin take the temporary spot of Empress. Lelouch snuggled into Suzaku's warm embrace as Draco and Harry silently thought about it together. Harry spoke first. "Nothing about that changes how I feel about you guys. Now I hold more respect, of course, but who am I to judge? All of us have had rough pasts and we need help getting over them," Harry said passionately. Draco smiled at him and wrapped his arms around his waist from behind. "I've been everything but angelic in the past, especially to Harry, and now is the time to make up for that," Draco said before kissing Harry lightly on the neck. Harry giggled and stood straighter, wiggling out of Draco's hold. "Now I do believe we have been keeping Severus waiting. Therefore we are keeping the Dark Lord himself waiting," Lelouch said warningly. "I need you two to behave and do as I say," Lelouch said to Gino and Suzaku as he leaned over and gave both of them a light kiss on the lips. "Yes, Your Highness," the smartass retort he was given as they gave him a mock bow. Lelouch cuffed them both on the back of the head before turning and leaving the Slytherin's dormitories, wondering how he got so lucky. /n. Thanks for all the reviews. I loved every single one of them. Lelouch stood in the dungeon corridor while Suzaku, Gino, Draco, Harry, Luciano, and Rollo exited the Slytherin common room to stand next to him. Gino handed Lelouch his helmet. "You were too focused on a grand entrance to remember to grab your helmet." "Real smooth," Suzaku commented. Lelouch pouted before turning to lead the way to Snape's personal chambers. "Ah, baby, don't be mad," Suzaku said and hurried after his prince. Draco laughed at their antics before turning to Harry. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Draco asked, concerned that Harry might have changed his mind about joining the Dark Lord. Harry tried to smile reassuringly at Draco as he spoke. "I'm sure, Draco. Don't be worried about me." His expression darkened when he remembered exactly why he was joining the Dark Lord in the first place. "Dumbledore left me in that hellhole almost 11 years, and even though I've told him everything that has been going on, he still makes me go back every fucking summer." He practically snarled as he remembered his less than satisfying childhood with the Dursleys. Draco grabbed his hand and gave him a reassuring squeeze before pulling Harry after the 5 Britannians, who had left to give them their moment. They caught up as Lelouch reached the door to Snape's office. "Are you mad?" Suzaku asked, upset. He grabbed Lelouch's arm as he raised it to knock. He spun Lelouch around to look him in the eyes. "I don't want to meet him with the least bit of doubt or anger between any of us," Suzaku said sternly. Lelouch smiled apologetically. "I was just giving you a hard time. It wasn't even a big deal anyway." Suzaku seemed to half believe it, so Lelouch pecked him on the nose for assurance. "It's fine, really." Lelouch leaned over to peck Gino on the cheek before turning back to the door. Luciano put his hand on Rollo's shoulder as reassurance to the smaller boy as Lelouch knocked loudly 3 times. He slipped on the Zero mask quickly. They waited for a tense moment before the door swung open to reveal the Snarky Potions professor. He scrutinized the group for a moment before moving out of the way to usher them in. "Where is Lelouch?" he asked before looking at Lelouch, who was in the Zero mask, in confusion. "I'm right here," Lelouch said before putting step 1 of his many plans into action. He slipped off the helmet and dropped it on the couch beside him. He reached his hand up and swiftly removed both of his purple contacts out of his eyes, revealing the GEASS in them. "I, Lelouch Vi Britannia, command you to never reveal my identity in any shape or form. You must not reveal it even through legimancy." Snape's eyes rimmed in the telltale red and he nodded. "Yes, Your Highness," he said before his eyes cleared. "I would like for you to keep this a secret," Lelouch said, knowing that Snape didn't remember what he just told him. "I can try, but no one can withstand the Dark Lord for long," Snape said. Lelouch nodded, understanding completely. "We are planning on using this fireplace to flew to the Riddle Mansion," he said while gesturing at the fireplace at the center of the room. "I'll go first, while Draco and Harry will follow me. I understand that Lelouch is your top priority," Snape said to Gino and Suzaku. "So it would be best if one of you went first, then Lelouch, then the other. Now you two," he said to Luciano and Rollo, "can go however you like." Luciano nodded. He would go last, as he was sure Gino and Suzaku could protect Rollo if things got rough on that side. He needed to stay back to make sure nobody came in as he and Rollo were leaving. Snape grabbed some flue powder from the pot and stepped into the rather tall fireplace. "Riddle Manor," he said, and erupted into emerald green flames as he was transported into the Dark Lord's home. Draco stepped in next and Harry quickly followed. Suzaku went next, corking a smile at Lelouch as he threw the power into the fire. Lelouch slipped on his Zero mask and went into the fireplace. He grabbed the flue powder and muttered his destination. The feeling of fluing was different than apparating, yet slightly the same. It was still a dizzying experience, but he didn't feel like curling up and dying afterwards. He stepped out of the fireplace and walked a few steps away to allow Gino to step through. Immediately Suzaku went to stand beside him, to keep his emperor safe. Only a few seconds later and Gino stepped beside them as soon as he stepped through the flue. Rollo came through next, followed by Luciano. Everyone looked to make sure everyone was fine, before Snape cleared his throat. "You 7 can stay here while I go and tell the Dark Lord of your arrival." Everyone nodded and Snape left fluidly, his cape billowing behind him. Luciano picked Rollo up and sat down on one of the emerald green armchairs, setting him on his lap as he did so. Rollo just sat there, looking from everyone's faces, instead of curling up into Luciano like he normally would. If someone were to come in and he had fallen asleep, he would be setting a bad first impression and he didn't want to for his brother's sake. Lelouch sighed under his mask and sat down in the only other chair, crossing one leg over the other as he did so. He folded his arms and began tapping his arm with on finger. Gino and Suzaku sat on either side of him on the armrest, They knew not to try to get too close to their lover when he was trying to appear as emotionless as possible. Gino patted him on the back reassuringly before pulling back his hand. Suzaku nodded to Gino before turning to stare at the door, as was all the Britannians, Draco, and Harry. No one jumped when the door snapped open, a loud crack resounding across the room. Snape came in, followed by a hairier-than-usual man. Snape looked around to make sure everyone was still there. When he saw they were, he motioned to the other man. "This is Fenrir Greyback. He will be escorting you to the Dark Lord. Be on your best behavior," he warned while looking everyone in the eyes. His eyes landed longer on Lelouch's covered face, having been talking to him more than anyone else. He did the same to Luciano. Zero stood, and the rest of the Britannians mirrored his movements. Fenrir gave them all a toothy grin before turning to the door. "If you'll follow me." He walked through the door. Rollo walked beside Zero as Suzaku led the rest. He stayed between Fenrir and the Prince and Emperor. Rollo and Lelouch were followed closely by Luciano and Gino, who were behind their respective charges. Behind them Harry and Draco trailed, not quite fitting in with the group of Britannians. They reached a large door that obviously led to the throne room. Fenrir knocked on the door before opening it as wide as it would go. He walked forwards without hesitation. Lelouch stepped forward and was flanked on either side by his two knights. Rollo walked with Luciano while Draco and Harry still walked side by side. Fenrir walked up to the throne where a young-looking man sat. His eyes were blood red, and his black hair reached the bottom of his ears. He looked at everyone calculating, not looking at all surprised by Lelouch's mask. Harry, on the other hand, was shocked to see Voldemort looking exactly how he had in the memories Dumbledore had showed him. He looked probably around 20, a few years older than what he had looked like in the memories, and Harry wasn't even sure that the memories he had saw were real anymore. He would have to ask Voldemort personally, when all his Death Eaters were kneeling in every inch of the floor other than the walkway. Their masks made them unrecognizable, but Harry was impressed by the sheer numbers. Fenrir bowed lowly as he reached his lord, making sure to not look him in the eyes as he did so. He knew it was an outward sign of disrespect, as all Death Eaters learned the hard way. Suzaku, Gino, and Luciano got down on one knee in respect while Rollo inclined his head. Zero, on the other hand, did nothing, not seeing why he should have to bow when he was there to make a deal with them, not become one of their mindless Death Eaters. Voldemort noticed Lelouch's lack of respect and quickly decided to help him sort his priorities. "Crucio," he hissed, and Lelouch dropped to the floor, writhing in agony. All the Death Eaters winced in sympathy under their masks, and they were all surprised when he didn't hear any screams or whimpers of pain. Suzaku and Gino helped him gently off the floor as soon as the tremors subsided. Lelouch looked unhappily up at the Dark Lord before practically purring. "I would appreciate it if you refrained from doing that ever again. It would probably be in your best interests." Voldemort looked at Lelouch, his eyes dancing with anger. "Everyone but my guests leave," he ordered, sneering at the word guests. Everyone quickly shuffled out of the room, not wanting to be in their angry lord's presence any longer than necessary. Once the room was silent, Voldemort's eyes narrowed at Zero, and he asked in a deadly calm voice, "You're going to regret saying that." Lelouch chuckled and removed his helmet. Voldemort's eyes widened as he saw how young the boy under the mask was. He was much too young to not be scared of him. He was about to speak when Lelouch interrupted him. He handed his helmet to Gino before putting the second part of his plan into action. "I, Lelouch Vi Britannia, command you, treat me as your superior. 2/N. Remember, check out my Luciano x Rollo one-shot if you like lemony smut." It was a request from Draco Shikachara Jutsu, who is my twin sister. Review 2. 1. Lelouch made sure to ask him when he would remember, as well as through GEASS. It would have been suspicious if Snape had went to tell the Dark Lord, when suddenly he couldn't speak. Now that Lelouch has asked him both ways, he shouldn't even start to tell the Dark Lord anything. 2. At first I was going to put, "Treat me as your equal," but I decided that wouldn't fit Lelouch's character. So I changed it to superior. Review for Severus made cookies and cream. Who liked this chapter better than the last one? Severus raised his hand. "Aw, Sev, you're so honest. 3. I love you guys. 3. The Death Eaters who had been patiently waiting outside the room quickly came back in roughly 5 minutes after the strangers had come in and caused a disturbance. They all had to admit, though, whoever the masked one was, he had guts. Even after going through Crucio, he still jabbed at Voldemort in a warning way. They all came in expecting to see the group gone or lying on the floor writhing in pain. They were shocked to see a matching chair next to Voldemort's. Beside it was a slightly smaller one. Currently Voldemort sat with his hands on his armrests, while the masked man sat in the chair next to it with his leg crossed over his knee, elbows resting on the armrest and fingers folded together. The smaller chair was taken by the smallest boy that had come. He was sitting with a cold and calculating look on his face, one you wouldn't expect to see on someone so young. They were silent as they all got into position, and once they were all kneeling, Voldemort spoke. I have discussed some things with the daring men up here. He started. The Death Eaters glanced out of the corner of their eyes, making sure to still be paying attention to their lord. We have an important ally on our side now. He yelled across the hall of people. His face broke out into a twisted look of glee. I present to you 0 and his Knights of 0 and 7 from Britannia. He gestured to the masked man and the 2 men on either side of him. We also have one of the princes of Britannia and his Knight of 10. The Death Eaters were silent as they looked at the strangers. They had heard their lord talk about Britannia and the massive war they just went through. The only person they heard Voldemort ever say he could stand was 0. They could tell by the way he talked of the guy, about how he felt that 0's way of handling situations and molding people to fit into his very palm. They weren't shocked when Voldemort told them of 0's victory. All he had told them was that the man named 0 won, and stepped up to become the emperor of the very country he was rebelling against. There were rumors that were flying around the Death Eaters of possibilities of the new emperor and his subordinates visiting to help with the war. If what Voldemort said was true, then they knew how valuable of an asset the men would be. No one wanted to be on 0's bad side. Voldemort held his hand up to silence the whispering Death Eaters. Now that you know of this matter, Voldemort said coolly before gesturing to his other side. Now for the main event. Voldemort went to stand next to the proud Draco. Draco Malfoy has done well. I gave him the task of helping me reach the one who was destined to kill me. Draco smirked and walked next to Harry, who was smirking as well. It wasn't as though he thought the only reason Draco had become friends with him was because of the task set by the Dark Lord. He knew that him and Draco honestly felt for each other. It was Draco's choice, not Voldemort's, to go to the next step in their relationship. It wasn't as though he needed to be sexually convinced to go to the Dark Lord. He was willing from the beginning. He was tired of Dumbledore trying to rule his life. Sure, not all of Voldemort's ways were right. It was the message he was trying to send out that appealed to him too heavily. Voldemort wouldn't lie to him. He would tell him if he didn't like him. He would say to his face he was a tool for the war. Harry didn't mind as long as it was said to his face. He was done with sugar-coated lies and guilt trips. Voldemort continued talking. I am proud to announce Harry Potter is now on the dark side of the war, he said in delight. His good-looking features turned into a smile as he faced only Harry, his back to the Death Eaters. Thank you, Harry, he said softly for him to hear. He turned back to announce the final part of the good news when suddenly a Death Eater spoke up. How dare you trick our Lord, Potter? Bellatrix said with a sneer. Her high voice teetered on the pit of insanity. The Dark Lord isn't in his right mind. He'll thank me later. She took a step closer. I've got you now, she yelled. She pointed her wand directly at Harry. Avada Kedavra. The electric green spell whipped through the air towards Harry. His eyes widened in fear. Suzaku snapped into action quickly, using his military reflexes to stand in front of Harry, who he had been standing close to. The spell hit him in the chest and his eyes widened as they rimmed a dark red even the Death Eaters in the back could see. Lelouch's command rang in his head as he fought off the killing curse. Live! 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 Lelouch's voice chanted. Outwardly Suzaku stood stock still. His eyes fell shut as he concentrated on fighting death. Live! 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 It wasn't hard when you had a red force field. And for once Suzaku was glad that Lelouch commanded him to live. He needed to stay to help protect and love his scarred lover, and Gino needed him too. They had been together longer than the two had been with Lelouch. Took hours for Suzaku, when in reality it happened in a few seconds. Suzaku opened his green eyes to glare harshly at the woman who tried to kill Harry. Everyone looked at Suzaku in shock while Gino and Lelouch breathed out twin sigh of relief. The attention wasn't on them though, as Suzaku stared Bellatrix down. His normally warm eyes were frozen as he stepped forward menacingly. The friendly boy looked downright scary. Bellatrix glanced at Voldemort to try and get him to rescue her from the man in front of her. She knew not to attack him if even the killing curse wouldn't kill the seemingly immortal boy. "Don't you dare touch Harry, especially with your spells." Suzaku spat. A cool hand was placed on Suzaku's shoulder. Suzaku turned to see the handsome face of Voldemort staring at him in approval. He nodded and stood aside as Voldemort took his place in scaring the hell out of the female Death Eater. "You foolish woman," Voldemort spat. "What nerve you have to attempt to assassinate my heir, Bellatrix," Voldemort hissed. Bellatrix's eyes widened in fear as she realized what he was saying. Why your heir? My Ella Lord?" She stuttered and winced as Voldemort bellowed. "You stupid woman. That is what I have just said." His blood-red eyes flashed dangerously as he pointed his wand at Bellatrix. "And no, my lord. I promise to do better," she pleaded as she fell to her knees. She grabbed onto his robes only to be kicked off by Voldemort. "No second chances," he said, and she froze in fear. "Avada Kedavra." The killing curse was yelled a second time and Bellatrix slumped to the floor, dead. Her husband stood off to the side, not even looking at his foolish wife. He knew better than to stand up for her. It had been an arranged marriage from the beginning, and to tell the truth it was nice to have her out of his hair. Voldemort went back to stand beside Harry and Draco. "Let this serve as a warning to all. Do not touch Harry Potter, my chosen heir," Voldemort said. Harry whispered in his ear and Voldemort nodded thoughtfully. "Might I add this warning? You are not to touch or harm Draco Malfoy, as he is Harry's chosen life partner and lover." He winked at Draco and Harry out of the corner of his eye. Draco possessively put his arms around Harry's waist as he eyed the crowd of Death Eaters. "Meeting dismissed," he said, and the Death Eaters apparated away. Harry slumped into Draco's arms tiredly. "Almost getting killed really. Sapped all of you energy out. Thanks, Voldemort," he said and smiled at the feared man. "Now as you are my heir you are to call me Tom, as is Draco." He turned to the Brittonnaires. "You two are allowed to call me Tom. This is a high honor, so don't abuse it," Tom said playfully. Harry nodded before yawning. "Maybe you should head back to the castle. I'm sure Severus won't mind leaving early." Severus nodded and headed back to the fireplace. "Snape's quarters, Hogwarts Castle," he said and disappeared in a flash of green. Draco and Harry left with cheerful waves. Rollo went after them and Luciano followed his small lover. "I'll let it go for now, but soon I will be calling for you," Tom said, referring to Suzaku's ability to survive the killing curse. Suzaku nodded his agreement and stepped into the fireplace. Soon the rest of the group was in Severus' office. "It is about 7 in the morning. I have some pepper-up potions for all of you and a potion I created for Lelouch," Severus said. At the group's confused looks Severus elaborated. "It will help with the minor after-effects of being held under Crucio. The pepper-up potions should keep you awake because of not sleeping." Lelouch nodded and the group looked at Lelouch worriedly. They drank the potions and watched as Lelouch drank the single potion he had to take. He wasn't allowed to take the pepper-up potion because of the affects the anti-pain potion Severus created had with other potions, such as the pepper-up potion. The group headed out of Snape's quarters and they stopped outside of the Slytherin common room. Draco pulled Harry in for a quick kiss before stepping into the common room. Lelouch pecked Gino and Suzaku each of the lips before pulling back. "Let's meet outside of the Great Hall as soon as you are done changing," he said. "Yes, sir," they both said with mock soldier salutes. Lelouch rolled his eyes before pulling them each down for a more appreciative kiss. Lelouch walked into the common room, leaving them both outside in a daze. He showered and changing quickly, and he, Draco, Luciano, and Rollo left the room to go to the entrance hall. Gino, Suzaku, and Harry were already waiting there. Lelouch smiled before taking Gino and Suzaku's hands. "How about we all sit at the Slytherin table today?" he asked as he led the group into the Great Hall. "Wait, we need to tell you something," Suzaku said hurriedly, but Lelouch didn't hear them. He froze at the threshold of the Great Hall and everyone looked at him, then back to the two blondes and brunette in the front of the room. Lelouch's eyes widened as he recognized the three men. Whispers of there being two Britannian princes there rushed around the room like wildfire. So they knew the two were princes. "They better not blow my cover then," Lelouch mentally warned, hoping they wouldn't refer to him as brother. "Lelouch!" Schneasel yelled, causing the Britannian emperor to look at him. Clovis spoke happily, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "It's good to see you, brother." Lelouch looked around hastily to see if anyone understood the meaning. His heart dropped as the great hall grew silent except for a few random gasps. If they knew that Schneasel and Clovis were princes, and they just called him brother, shit, Lelouch said mentally as he tried to figure out a way to cover this over. He didn't have a chance as Clovis ran up to him. He put one hand on Lelouch's shoulder and put the other on his own chest. "My dearest brother, when you left without saying goodbye it was as though you ripped out my heart. You're my baby brother. I care for you." Lelouch swore Clovis kept calling him brother to spite him, even though he knew that Clovis and Schneasel didn't know that Lelouch was undercover. Lelouch started to wish he had told them, even though they weren't supposed to even be near Hogwarts in the first place, but just in case. That way the whole school wouldn't suddenly know of him being a prince. With his luck, next thing you know somehow everyone would not only know he was a prince but an emperor too. Lelouch waved Gino, Luciano, and Suzaku to go on with Harry and Draco. This was between the princes, not their knights. Lelouch pulled them by the arms out to the now empty entrance hall. Lelouch came to a stop when he was at the bottom of the steps. He let go of Schneasel and Clovis and started pacing. Rollo sat on the stairs beside the unfamiliar brunette. "I can't belly." Lelouch stopped and pulled his hair in frustration. He started to walk the other way. "This is my fault," he said and continued to pace back and forth. Schneasel and Clovis watched as he walked back and forth in confusion. Finally Clovis got frustrated with the silence. "What is wrong, Lelouch?" he asked as he put his hand on Lelouch's shoulder. "You suddenly freaked out when you saw us. You want to know?" Lelouch asked as he fingered his hair. "I've been going under the name Lelouch Lamperouge the entire time I have been here. They had no idea that I was a prince, let alone related to royalty. When you announced you were princes that would have been fine, but then you called me brother." Lelouch finished. Clovis looked visibly upset, too. "We didn't know." He trailed off while looking off to the side guiltily. Schneasel, on the other hand, didn't. "You never told us." "I know it wasn't likely we would come here, but every good chess player thinks of any options, no matter how unlikely," Schneasel said matter-of-factly, causing Lelouch to roll his eyes. Leave it to Schneasel to put chess and any other subject together. Lelouch suddenly remembered the stranger sitting on the stairs next to Rollo. "Who are you?" he asked, curious as to why Rollo looked so comfortable around him. The young man stood before answering. "I am Earl Canon Maldini, Prince Schneasel's assistant and right-hand man," he said and smiled at the emperor. "It's nice to meet you, your majesty," he said politely. Lelouch looked at Schneasel with a raised eyebrow. Schneasel would never keep someone so good-looking around him and not be in some sort of relationship with him. He knew his brother well. Schneasel smiled at Lelouch. "You know me too well, Lelouch," he said and pulled Canon possessively to his chest. "We've been together roughly 2 years now." Canon rolled his eyes good naturally and leaned into Schneasel's large chest happily. Whenever Schneasel announced their relationship, he always sounded so proud of himself and happy to be with him. That wasn't the Schneasel Canon met 3 years ago, and he had to admit he liked the change. "So Lelouch, I heard you and your knights are closer than ever," Schneasel hinted suggestively, causing Lelouch to blush a light red hue. "It's about time," he said with a laugh. "I'm kind of glad our dad is dead," Clovis said randomly. Everyone looked at the blonde prince in confusion. "Haha." He laughed nervously, not realizing he had said this out loud. What I meant was if our parents were alive, they would be wondering why in the hell all their male children turned out gay. 3. He finished with a smile. Everyone turned to look at Clovis. Sure, they all had their assumptions on the blonde's sexuality, but this was the first time they had heard the blonde confirm their suspicions. Are you with anyone? Lelouch asked, wondering just how much he missed in the short time since he left Britannia.
No.
Clovis said with a depressed sigh. He looked away, fake tears in his eyes. I just felt so lonely all by myself that when we received an invitation to have a feast at Hogwarts, I jumped at the chance, he said and smiled brightly, tears now gone. Lelouch mentally rolled his eyes at his brother's dramatics. He was about to speak when Clovis continued, maybe I might find me a good-looking wizard to get all cozy with, he said, causing Lelouch and Schneasel to actually roll their eyes. Lelouch shuffled his feet before sighing. Let's go back in, shall we? The damage is done, he said, and suddenly felt much older than he actually was. Clovis stepped up to him and put a hand on Lelouch's shoulders, a serious glint in his eyes. Everything will end up okay, he said, trying to reassure his younger brother. Lelouch nodded his head, outwardly showing he thought everything would be fine. Inwardly he stressed the situation at hand even more. This ruins all the progress I have done with Dumbledore and spying on him. I will need to think of a new plan, he thought as he turned and led the way into the Great Hall. He noticed as he went inside several things he hadn't noticed before. In between the staff table and house tables was a smaller and much shorter table. Above it hung the Britannian flag, which Lelouch shuddered in distaste at. He led the way to the table where Luciano, Suzaku, and Gino were sitting. Gino and Suzaku stood as their emperor came in front of them and nodded respectfully to the other three princes. It's good to see you, Canon, Gino said warmly while Suzaku simply smiled at the brunette. Canon smiled a small smile back and watched as his lover and commander sat down. He stood behind him and looked out at the crowd staring out at the group. Lelouch and Rollo sat down, Gino, Suzaku, and Rollo stood behind their respective knights. It was a custom for the knights and servants to not sit at the same table as the royal family when it was important dinner. Lelouch huffed before turning around. He grabbed the sleeves of his knights and pulled them closer to him. He lightly shoved them onto the seats behind him. Schneasel looked at his younger brother in amusement before looking over his shoulder at Canon. He lifted one finger and curled it, motioning for his lover to come sit next to him. Luciano sat down next to Rollo without being asked to, knowing his young prince would want him to. Schneasel reached over and grabbed his right-hand man's hand and curled their fingers together before setting them on the table. Canon was used to this kind of treatment, but he couldn't help the small blush that snuck up on his face. The people around the room started gossiping loudly, and Schneasel looked as though he didn't have a care in the world as he carefully placed a small piece of chicken in his mouth. Lelouch smiled at his brother's openness and continued eating. Once they were done, Gino looped his arm around Lelouch's waist. Lelouch turned away from Gino and leaned against the taller male. He laced both hands with Suzaku's comfortably, and they waited for the other three princes to finish their meals. Luciano had finished eating earlier than the other three. He simply pulled the still eating Rollo in his lap. Rollo didn't even show any sign of surprise or discomfort as he simply pulled his plate back in front of him and continued eating. Luciano wound his long arms around Rollo's skinny waist and leaned his head on his shoulder. Every now and then Rollo would offer him a bite to eat, but other than that he was content with just holding his prince. Clovis watched the couples through the cover his blonde bangs created over his eyes. He pushed his food around, no longer hungry for anything food-related. Clovis suddenly felt the need to leave, to get away from everyone who was happily in a relationship, to not be the third wheel of the group. He stood hastily and forced a realistic smile on his lips that even Lelouch didn't see through. He turned and headed through the doors of the Great Hall, ignoring the looks the students sent him. He already knew where he was staying and headed through the narrow halls of the castle. Head bowed, he turned around the corner only to bump into someone. Oomph! Clovis' breath was knocked out of him as he stumbled back, catching his balance before he could fall. A hand grabbed his arm to hold him steady, and Clovis looked up to see the most perfect image he could think of. Wow! I know some people believe that Canon has pink hair while others believe he is brown. For the sake of Canon's image for this story, I am sticking with brown, even though I personally believe it to be a pinkish brown. 2. Clovis didn't get much screen time in the anime. I'm sure he had a set character attitude somewhere, but I really just want to play with his overly dramatic side a little bit. He might seem a bit blonde at times, but that's the way I want him. 3. Not mentioned is Odysseus U. Britannia. He's gay 2 but he isn't with anyone. He's a lonely gay prince, just like Clovis. If you have a problem with them being cuddly, go read my warnings. Cough out of characterness. Sure, you might not think they would realistically be cuddling, but I liked it. Huff. Anyways, thanks for the reviews and I'm sorry for the wait. Important info you must know. Anyone feeling lonely for poor Clovy? I need help from you guys. Include in your reviews on who you want to be with Clovis. Remember, Clovis is gay, so it needs to be a guy. It can be someone older, younger, dead. I'm good at bringing people back to life. Haha, alive, 2 people, 1 person, 3 people, heck, I don't care. Give me your ideas. If there is someone you do not want him to be with, put that too. Thanks, guys. Melodious. I love you.
Ansnapa, Asnapa, Grumbla.
Melodious. I'm sorry I didn't include you in the chappy. I'll put you in the next one. Somehow. Snape? You better. Axel. Snape, I'm sure you'll get over it just fine. You get a lot of screen time anyway. Be careful or others might think that you're an attention hog. Lelouch watched as his older brother gave a smile before heading outside. He and Schneasel exchanged bewildered looks before Lelouch straightened out, no longer leaning on his blonde lover. He released Suzaku's hands and stood, ready to follow his brother. No matter how often Lelouch felt annoyed by his older brother's theatrics, he still remembered the brotherly bond they shared when they were young and ignorant to the world. He was about to go out of the great hall when Schneasel's loud voice stopped him. Brother, he said, and Lelouch turned to look at him. Clovis just needs time. Alone. He finished, and Lelouch looked torn. Sure, they were never really close in the past couple years, but they were brothers. He knew that if it had been him, Clovis would be just as eager to go and help his brother and find out what was bothering him so deeply. But Schneasel had been around Clovis as of lately, and he most likely knew what was going on with his blonde brother. Lelouch was pulled down into Suzaku's lap gently, but firmly. Lelouch struggled for a second, but knowing his chances of escaping his extremely strong boyfriend, he quickly stopped and huffed before shifting to get more comfortable. Gino smiled at them before standing and stretching. As comfortable as you have just gotten, he smirked friendly down at them. Why don't we head to our rooms to stay until curfew? He asked, and the 2 nodded. They all stood, and Lelouch suddenly had an idea. Why don't we go to the astronomy tower? He asked, secretly wanting to see the stars. Sure, he was lazy and hated school work, but stars had always interested him. Gino smiled at him, seeming to read his smallest lover's thoughts. They followed Lelouch out of the great hall where Lelouch led them to the tower, hand in hand. Page break. Clovis jumped when the man in front of him coughed, trying to get the other blonde to realize he was staring. Clovis blushed and looked away before looking back out of the corner of his eyes. He couldn't help it. This man was the most beautiful man he had ever seen. His straight, white blonde hair reached past his shoulders and to his mid-back. His face was closed off, yet there was still an amused smirk twitching on his lips. His gray eyes showed none of his emotions, and his aristocratic features told Clovis that he was dealing with what Schneasel called a pureblood. His robes were in top condition and were crisp and clean. His wand holster had a topper with a snake, and his hands were covered in black gloves. Clovis was extremely curious to find out who this strange man was, but he knew he needed to impress this man. Clovis pulled himself up to his full height and twisted his face into one he normally wore on the cameras back in Britannia. His mask showed his confidence, along with his feeling of superiority, while mentally he was still checking out the man in front of his. You must be one of the princes. The angel spoke, causing the Britannia to almost faint. His voice was smooth like velvet, and oh, that accent! It was the icing on the cake. A very, very delicious cake. Clovis snapped out of his thoughts of the angel in front of him covered in icing and nodded, pushing back the blush that was threatening to appear. Lucius Malfoy, his name was obviously French, a beautiful name for a beautiful man. Pleasure to meet you. He finished as he gracefully lifted his hand toward Clovis, palm upwards. Clovis Lou Britannia, and the pleasure is all mine, Clovis said, putting his hand in Lucius. Clovis was shocked as the beautiful pureblood lifted his hand with his own and placed his perfect lips on it. Clovis was glad he had taken off his gloves at dinner, as the feeling of the older man's lips on his hand was magnificent. Faster than Clovis would have liked it, Lucius lowered his hand before letting go completely, dragging his fingers along Clovis' palm as he did so, causing Clovis' body to give an involuntarily shiver of desire. Lucius lifted one corner of his perfect lips in a half-smile. I'll see you around, Clovis, he drawled while practically purring Clovis' name. Clovis couldn't do anything more than nod, his mask close to shattering under the pressure of the beautiful man in front of him. Lucius walked by the frozen Clovis with a swirl of his robes, carefully brushing his shoulder as he did so. Lucius didn't need to look back to know the blonde prince had turned to look at his retreating figure. Lucius smirked, and for once it wasn't twisted in sadistic glee. The trip to visit Draco might last longer than he had originally thought, with the new blonde in the equation. Not that Lucius minded. His smirk grew wider. He didn't mind at all. Chapter 17 end. Thanks to the following for reviewing. Dragonfire 20. Chapter 17. Thanks. I try really hard on it. Gred and Forge will be used. Just not with Clovey. But if you have any more ideas then let me know. Melody 89. Chapter 17. Yeah, now that you mention it, it is science versus magic. I try not to make them too OC, but I can't help it. Good to know you like them being cuddly. You almost convinced me to make him be with Snape. Almost. Alec 963. Chapter 17. It would be awesome if I made him be with Riddle. But because I already kind of interpreted him as Voldemort now, it won't really work. Great idea though. Aquamarine Lacus. Chapter 17. I know. Maybe Victor can come in and be crazy jealous. Rain. Chapter 17. Cedric, Neville, Blaze and Victor are all wonderful ideas, but I really want him with someone older than him. Thanks for the milk and cookies. I hope to write more soon too. Vampire Cat 1191. Chapter 1. It is Draco x Harry and Gino x Suzaku x Lelouch. Good thing you pointed that out. I need to be more careful. Merciless Hearts. Chapter 17. Thanks for your review. As for your suggestion, I'm not ignoring it. I would totally say that works, except I need him to be outed as a prince to move my plot forward. But that is a very good idea. Dragons Chaotica. Chapter 17. Your dedication to my story makes me wiggle in excitement. Was it worth reading with a 100-degree temperature? Axel No 7I. Chapter 17. You beta and review. You are the meaning of awesome. Suki Dragon. Chapter 17. You vote Snape too? I wish I could picture him with Clovey. Ranger Mitsuki. Chapter 17. I would totally chose Nagato, but I really wanted it to be a Harry Potter character. To mix the species, so to speak. Haha, that sounds weird. Envy's Mistress. Chapter 17. Reformatted and ready to read. Munyazu 9. Chapter 17. Justin Finch Fletchley was a new one. I know I told you I was choosing Oliver, but I changed my mind. Sorry. Fady. Chapter 17. Thanks for double reviewing. I didn't mean to screw up the formatting. That was my iPod's fault. Thanks for the anonymous reviews too. I was too lazy to reply to them though. Lelouch sat in the center of the couch in the Gryffindor common room, staring absent-mindedly into the fire. He almost jumped when a hand was placed on his shoulder. He looked back to see Suzaku's caring eyes looking at him imploringly, wanting to know what was wrong with his best friend and lover. Lelouch offered a half-smile, glad for the comfort. Suzaku walked around the edge of the couch and sat in the corner before pulling Lelouch half in his lap. Lelouch's smile continued as he laid his head in the crook of Suzaku's neck, nuzzling the brunette. For the past few days, Lelouch had seemed almost distant from his lovers. He wouldn't ignore them. He just wasn't acting like himself. Gino and Suzaku had been worried, and both tried on several occasions to find out what was wrong. Are you ready to tell us what's wrong? Suzaku whispered into Lelouch's hair. Lelouch seemed to deflate a little in his arms, as he sunk further into Suzaku and the couch's warmth. I need just a little more time, I promise. Lelouch said, his eyes tightly shut, as though he was worried Suzaku would be mad. Suzaku just placed an understanding kiss behind Lelouch's ear, as he wrapped his arms around Lelouch even tighter. That was how Gino found them an hour later, fast asleep in each other's arms. Gino smiled at the sight, before grabbing a nearby blanket and slipping it over the two. Grabbing his cup of coffee he had brought with him from the kitchen, he curled up at the two's feet at the other corner and pulled the blanket around himself. He opened his textbook, content to read until the early hours of the morning. Lelouch was the first to awake. He carefully lifted his head from its resting place on Suzaku's muscled chest to look around. The only other in the room besides the three on the couch was Neville Longbottom, who was writing more on an already outrageously long herbology essay. Lelouch glanced at his feet to see Gino curled up, an open book sitting on his lap. He smiled before sitting up slowly. After kissing the corner of Suzaku's mouth, he stood up, stretching and popping his back. Neville looked up at the sound of movement and gave Lelouch a small smile before looking back at his essay. Lelouch turned to the edge of the couch and carefully pried the book from Gino's hands. Curiosity got the better of the Britannian Emperor as he glanced at the open page of the book. His heartbeat quickened as he read the title, Trio Bonding Ceremonies Used in Wizarding Society. Lelouch couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to be bonded to the two beautiful, amazing people next to him. He had heard being bonded was amazing with the right people or person. You could feel their every emotion, their every desire. Lelouch couldn't help the feeling of hope that bubbled up as he placed the book back in Gino's arms. No need to let Gino know that Lelouch knew what he was planning. Lelouch wanted to see if he would really go through with it. Lelouch sat down on the table in between the two couches, the one with his lovers and the one with Neville, and called a house elf. The one that appeared was named Dobby. Lelouch remembered, having seen him being called by Harry on several occasions. He asked the house elf to bring up breakfast for him and the other two. Turning to Neville, he asked if wanted anything too. Neville looked up in surprise. Sure, he said, shocked that someone paid attention to him. Lelouch gave him a tiny smile and turned back to the house elf with a nod. Get some breakfast for him too, please. With a bow and a pop, the house elf was gone. Clovis sat in the great hall, feeling ridicules for getting up so early, almost like a kid on Christmas. He looked around, feeling disappointed. His reason for getting up so early hadn't showed up at all. Clovis got up from his empty table and walked to the entrance hall, where he froze in place. There across from him was the object of his obsessions. He had a hand on a blonde male student only slightly shorter than him, with the same swirling gray eyes. Clovis watched as the smaller gave a small smile before turning and walking towards the great hall. Lucius didn't even look up at the smaller leave, just turned and walked down the corridors that led to the dungeons, also where Clovis' room resided. The smaller blonde look-alike walked past Clovis with a glance, leaving Clovis to make a decision. Follow Lucius or wait to give Lucius the chance to find him. Clovis started walking towards the dungeons before he even made up his mind. Winding, Clovis hurried down the corridor, intent on not losing his target. He caught up to the blonde and almost called out to him when he saw him go into a classroom, leaving the door open. Clovis snuck up to the door, listening carefully for any sign that Lucius would come back out. So, he heard an unfamiliar voice say, I did it. We're officially divorced. Lucius said smugly, I never have to deal with that bitch ever again. The voice spoke again. I'm glad for you, Lucius. I really am. I don't know what I'd do without you. Sev? Lucius whispered. Silence followed, causing Clovis to glance in curiously. His eyes widened as he saw Lucius embracing the slightly shorter black-haired man he vaguely remembered as Severus Snape. He jerked back with a sharp breath before putting his hand over his mouth, eyes still wide. Did you hear that? Lucius asked in his voice like velvet, causing Clovis to shiver even in his shock. By the time Severus and Lucius glanced out of the doorway, Clovis had left as quickly as possible, trying to ignore the burning of tears in his eyes. Draco looked up at his father as he placed his hand on his shoulder. "It's really good to see you. I'm happy for you and the Potter boy. I really am," Lucius said. Draco's eyes widened in amazement at his father's statement as his breath got caught in his throat. Never in a million years had Draco ever thought his father would approve of him being with a male, let alone Harry Potter, the boy who lived. "Thanks, Dad," he managed to say. Now that he knew his father approved of his relationship, he knew he was ready to tell the world of his and Harry's relationship. With a small smile, Draco turned to walk to the Great Hall to find his boyfriend and get something to eat. He noticed one of the new princes staring at the direction of where he and his father had been standing. If he remembered correctly, the prince's name was Clovis Lee Britannia, one of Lelouch's elder half-brothers. He glanced at him as he walked past and into the Great Hall before scanning the Gryffindor table for his Gryffindor. He caught Harry's eye and stalked towards him, a predatory look in his gaze. Harry gulped, looking scared and hopeful at Draco's expression. Draco walked up to Harry and leaned down, capturing the brunette's lips from across the table. Slowly the whole table grew quiet, then the nearby tables, and eventually the whole room as they watched Draco's tongue search Harry's mouth before pulling back, leaving Harry wanting more. "Hello, love," Draco drawled with a smirk at Harry's dumbstruck look, loud enough for everyone to hear. Draco sort of wished he had waited until it was a school day instead of a weekend to get the maximum effect, but overall he was just relieved he could show his appreciation for his boyfriend in front of anyone he wanted. Harry looked at Draco with a blush. "Hey Dre," Harry almost whispered in his shock. Then a smile broke across his face as he realized what this meant. "Your father approved?" "Yeah, he did," Draco said with a hint of a smile on his face. Harry smiled wider. Harry could see the headlines for the Prophet now. "Boy who lived is boy who likes boys?" Strangely, Harry realized as Draco held his hand across the table. He couldn't care less what they thought. He was happy with Draco, his lover, regardless of what everyone thought.